"You mean to try and avoid the Lutine, sir?" asked Collins. "I mean to get close enough to Toulon, to the Grand Rade, to spot what ships are anchored there. Then I mean to put up our helm and run west with all speed, with our signal flags flying. Our friend here will be in our path, and as Mr. Glaister has so properly pointed out, he will have the weather gauge. But he will struggle to tell anyone our messages are negative. We may manage to avoid him once, yet once he has the wind in his favour, I doubt we will do so twice. The notion is simple. The Admiral commanding the Toulon fleet will be given something to think about, like, is there a British squadron just over the horizon? Enough, perhaps, to think twice about putting to sea." He did not add that the whole thing hinged on his taking or beating the Lutine, a message for which he could have got a cheer. That was forthcoming anyway when he announced a tot of rum for every hand. Those at quarters on deck were doing what had been ordered, manning the falls and easing them slightly so that the lower parts of the sails were not drawing properly. It was slight, but the increase in the wind playing on Ralph Barclay's back told him just how much speed they had lost. "Not too much, Mr. Collins. Remember he has seen us before on a wind." "Aye, aye, sir." "Perhaps," said Glaister, "we should gather the hands, sir, while we still have time, and give the rousing speech." It was at that point that Ralph Barclay regretted his prior openness, realizing that by relaxing his habitual silence he had raised the expectation that it would be the norm. It was with something of a tone more familiar to his Premier that he snapped, "What a strange notion, Mr. Glaister! The crew will know what to do when the time comes, and if they fail in that they will answer to me. Now I think we must complete what has gone before. Clear for action." Chapter 8. "Topsails, Mr. Collins, if you please." The orders were shouted, and the topmen began to clew up the courses out of harm's way, as well as everything forward bar the flying jib. It was not wise to go into action with all sails set, hanging low. The mainsails were prone to catch fire from either shot or the flaming wads that were discharged with the ball leaving the enemy cannon. If such a stretch of canvas ignited, bone dry after a week without rain, it could spread to the whole ship, which meant certain destruction. As soon as they were out of harm's way, the hose from the fire engine was hauled aloft, and the crew on deck pumped hard to wet the topsails and make them less vulnerable to the same danger, though their elevation high up on the masts was the main protection. It had the added advantage of sending a message to his opponent that he was preparing to fight. There were some fine calculations for Ralph Barclay to make. He intended to get by this enemy frigate, now hull up, but that would not happen unless he could bluff his opposite number. Positions reversed, he would be calculating when to wear onto the same course as Brilliant, so ensuring that the British ship had to fight a running battle, hoping they might decline for fear of too much damage. It would not be cowardice on the Frenchman's part. He would have done his duty, as well as the task to which he had been assigned, and kept secret the state of the Toulon fleet. Because of the sea haze, it was impossible, even for the lookout high on the foremast, to yet see into the Grand Rade, and a mere sighting in this case would not do. He needed to convince his enemies that he had learnt their strength from observation. Anything else would not affect their preparations or their intention to weigh. With yards braced right round to take the wind and sailing some 20 points free, the enemy deck was in plain view, and he paid close attention to the position they had taken up. "I thought, Captain Barclay, that I would take a last breath of air before going below to aid Mr. Lutyens." Ralph Barclay spun round to face his wife, irritated that she had not asked permission to be on what was about to be a fighting platform. But then he softened at the sight of her. "The lady-hole has been prepared for you." "No, husband, I shall, as I did previously, help Mr. Lutyens." "So be it. I would say you have a safe 20 minutes, my dear, and perhaps you should ask Mr. Coyle, since he has been instructing you, to issue you some pistols." Emily waved towards the bows, then slipped her hand through his arm. "I may be a novice in these matters, husband, but I do know this much. If the crew of that French ship get as far as the cockpit, I doubt if a pair of pistols will affect the outcome." Tempted to kiss her forehead, to make plain his own feelings, Ralph Barclay had to remind himself where he was, who was watching, and what they were sailing into. This was no time for public displays of affection. "They will not, my dear, though our friend ahead sees it as a possibility."
"May I ask what you anticipate?"
"I am hoping he intends to sail by on the opposite course, and by backing his topsails, try to get across my stern so he can rake us where we are most vulnerable. He may do so, only to find that he is trying to destroy us at long range. But he can just as easily bar our passage and force us to fight on his terms. Whatever he does, I will get beyond him."
Easy to say, trickier to do. He needed to fully man his guns on one side, hopefully get off 2 salvos to his opponent's 1, but following that he had to get enough topmen aloft to let fall his mainsails, with the required hands on deck to sheet them home, this while his guns needed reloading. It was a circle impossible to square, especially against an enemy who would have other ideas. So he just decided that he had to stick to his plan and hope that it worked.
"I think I can best him, because he will have to change tack at least once before he can engage, and he will not know my aim is to get past him. The real danger is in having succeeded, thus giving the appearance of examining the French fleet when we put up our helm to escape. In that case, as you will readily appreciate, the positions are reversed. He will be sure he has me in a bind, but I am equally sure his crew are not as well worked up as ours, and that is doubly true in gunnery. I anticipate he will not be able to stand against our rate of fire, even if he has the wind, and that we will get past him a second time."
"There will be casualties?"
"I fear that is inevitable, my dear, but I think more on the enemy deck than our own."
Emily used her arm to squeeze his and said, "Then I pray that you are not one of them, my dear."
That said, she disengaged herself and went below to join Lutyens, busy fiddling with the layout of his instruments, brushing the old piece of worn canvas covering his operating table, a set-out series of sea chests. "Enemy preparing to come onto the starboard tack, sir," cried the lookout. "Mr. Sykes, attend upon me if you please."
The burly boatswain came aft, hoping that the captain had not spotted some area in which he had been remiss.
"Mr. Glaister will use the speaking trumpet, but I want that backed up by your pipes, so that there is no doubt about the orders." "Aye, aye, sir." "And, Mr. Sykes, the hands must move swiftly. Given we are likely to engage on our larboard side, the topmen will have to go aloft on the lee shrouds. Make sure they do not, by habit, head for the weather shrouds, for if they do, half of them will fall to musket fire as they ascend. Are you happy with the arrangements so far?" "Once the deadlights are shipped, which is being seen to now, I am, sir."
Ralph Barclay imagined the effect of that. The thick boards across his casement windows, set to discourage boarding in what was the most vulnerable part of a fighting ship, would cut out any hint of daylight, leaving the only source of that the open gun ports. Even more depressing was the fact that they could be smashed into deadly splinters that would race down the open main deck, maiming and killing on the way, an image that nearly made him shudder. Instead, he patted Sykes on the shoulder by way of encouragement. "Then all we can do now is pray to God that everything goes well." A stillness descended on the ship. Everything that needed to be done in preparation was complete. Even the powder monkeys were idle, for all the guns were fully served with their cartridges, quills, flints, the gunners' powder horns full, their lanyards tested, the crews crouched and ready for the reload. Aloft and on the forecastle the marines were lined up, weapons at the ready. Ralph Barclay kept his eye on the enemy deck, relieved that once the act of changing tack was complete, the men manning the falls went back to their guns. The 2 vessels approached each other, both with their cannon trained as far forward as the gun ports would allow, the French captain probably aware that he would only get off 1 real broadside. How would he react in receipt of 2? Did he know that British gunnery, through constant practice, was generally superior in rate of fire? These were all questions without answers, best not dwelt on. All Ralph Barclay knew was one fact, that it was this for which he had spent his life training, that today, though not his first sea fight, was a moment of truth,
A single-ship action against an enemy warship in which all the decisions made would be his. Could he lead men into an even contest and not only achieve his aim, but once he had warned to get back to sea, take on this same enemy and either take him or get free? Suddenly that seaman's dinner, that salty pork, the scouse and the hard biscuit, not to mention the wine, did not feel so comfortable in his belly. There was a moment when, his mouth full of saliva, he thought he might be sick, and indeed a small amount of bile rose to burn his throat. But it passed as he steeled himself to give the order, which would come as soon as the gun captain furthest forward, sighting through the port, raised his hand to say he had the enemy in view. The silence, which would soon be shattered, was total. No one moved, no one spoke as the two frigates closed at a range of not much more than a long musket shot. The gunner's arm shot up, and Ralph Barclay nodded to Glaister, who raised his trumpet and shouted just as the first puff of black smoke emerged from the leading enemy ordnance. "Fire as you bear!" "Mark the time, Mr. Glaister." The rolling broadside erupted from both ships, the French balls screaming high as the enemy captain tried to wound a vital mast. That was not the way of the gunners of HMS Brilliant. Their shot poured one by one into the side of the enemy, smashing bulwarks and cracking scantlings, which sent splinters flying in all directions. Kill or maim the gunners, and you emasculate the ship, lay behind the tactics, though few now furiously reloading could have put it in those terms. Handspikes were working too, to turn the trunnions so that they faced square on to the enemy, and Ralph Barclay, standing stoically as shot, musket balls, and detached rigging whistled round his head, felt pride as the first gun on his deck fired before the last had been discharged, taking out 10 foot of rail on the Frenchman, the effect of that flying wood obvious from the agonized screams which came across the intervening water. Glaister barked out a new set of orders through the speaking trumpet, backed up by the faint whistle of the boatswain's pipes, reinforcing the message that the men should get to their sailing stations as soon as the twice-discharged cannon was safely lashed off tight to the bulwarks. Above their heads there were several holes in the canvas, as well as an almighty crash as one French ball took a chunk out of the lower mainmast, thankfully only a wound, not enough to truly render it useless. The French captain must have seen what was happening, that his enemy's guns were being housed, and guessed what Ralph Barclay was up to. He put up his helm immediately and tried to use the wind to get his bows round to run inboard of his opponent and stop him dead. But the breeze, while durable, was not enough to oblige him, and he found himself suddenly taken aback, for he had not trimmed his yards to accommodate the manoeuvre. All that was happening while Brilliant's topmen got aloft and began to loosen the mainsails. What few men could be spared, those of the quarterdeck cannon, especially the carronades, kept firing, keeping down the heads of the enemy gunners. This while the few marines that Ralph Barclay could spare to man the mainmast cap played with musket fire on the French quarterdeck. The rest, along with the hands, had laid aside their weapons and were hauling on ropes to sheet home the mainsails, which had an effect on the ship as soon as it was achieved. HMS Brilliant picked up speed on the wind and took off with an inelegant shudder that strained her masts, leaving the captain to wonder if he had been too precipitate. But nothing carried away, and soon they were clear, with the enemy ship still trying to come round, still showing enough of her stern and the name Lutine standing out in gold for a parting broadside. They would never answer, given the increasing range. "Mr. Glaister, note the time again. I want a report of any damage and any casualties. Then get a cask of beer up from below. The men will have a raging thirst." "Aye, aye, sir." There was a crash as a lucky long shot removed a section of Brilliant's taffrail, but that did not deter her captain from ascending to the poop to play his telescope on the enemy deck. It was certain that the Frenchman had suffered more than he, hardly surprising given his better rate of fire. What was obvious was that such a thing was no longer a surprise, and would be bound to affect the next phase of the action. But as of this moment he could feel reasonably satisfied. The cry of the foremast lookout, kept aloft throughout the action to give notice of clarity in the Rade of Toulon, ruined that, as he called down to identify another sail beyond and to the northwest, weathering Cape Cicier, its location and course, as well as the flag flying from the masthead, dashed any idea that it might be a friend instead of an enemy. Ralph Barclay was suddenly acutely aware that it was the Poulette, and that he may well have strayed into a carefully prepared trap, while equally conscious of the fact that everyone on deck was looking at him for reassurance. The question was simple. His best chance, though a slim one, of getting out of this fix was to wear immediately, and hope that he could get clear of Lutine before her consort could close and make the odds insurmountable. He could not bring himself to do it, for that would mean another attempt to avoid combat. He had to make sure his enemy knew their dispositions were discovered, so forcing himself to be calm, he said, "We must hold our course, gentlemen, and carry out the task we set ourselves. Once that is completed, we will deal with what follows." It was agreeably received, evidenced by the nods he got, not just from his quarterdeck officers, but from the quartermaster and his men on the wheel. "One topman wounded by a ball in the shoulder, sir," said Glaister, "and another who tripped over his cannon and has a serious gash on his head." "Thank you," Ralph Barclay replied, thinking that he had got off lightly, something that would not happen twice. Further news came from aloft to say that Lutine had altered course to the south, this with a clear view to cutting off his escape in that direction, while Poulette headed for the position she had just vacated. Lutine would not stray far, just enough to ensure that he had to fight to get clear. The task now to stop news of the state of the fleet from reaching Hotham. Again Ralph Barclay craved someone to talk to, another officer of equal rank with whom he could weigh the odds and discern, through conversation, how they could be dealt with. It mattered not that it would be a discussion about how to fight two ships, not if, for they would have to face one or the other, and with HMS Brilliant sailing into the wind, having handed his enemies the weather gauge, they held all the cards. Once engaged and under topsails, it would be a simple matter for the non-engaged French frigate to pile on all sail and close in, hoping to trap him between two fires. It was not silent now. The carpenter was busy inspecting the mainmast and calling for battens and ropes with which to gammon it. Not much in the way of adding strength, but it was best to do something rather than nothing. Sykes was directing those aloft who were attending to damaged rigging, while the quarter-gunners and gun-captains were fussing round their cannons, slowly reloading each in turn, for most of the crew were still on sailing duties. On the slate in front of him, Ralph Barclay could see the 2 times that Glaister had marked. One when action had commenced, the other when it had ceased, with that ball through the taffrail. Only 7 minutes in all. It would have been better to destroy Lutine, for in that time, in theory, he could have put aboard her 7 or more broadsides. "We have the Rhine in view, Captain," called the lookout after some 10 minutes. "Though it be misty, but I can see plain that it be full of ships." "Then we have done that for which we came. Mr. Glaister, get that signal aloft. Mr. Collins, prepare to wear ship. I want a course that splits our enemies until we can see which of them can close at the greatest rate." HMS Brilliant came round sweetly, and with the sails sheeted home and the yards braced right round, they brought her as close to the wind as she would bear, her prow dissecting the sea between the Frenchmen. Ralph Barclay, with the wind in his face, looked from one to the other, trying in that most tricky calculation of triangulation at sea to make out who was nearest, for that was the one he must fight first. It took time to be sure it was Poulette, racing to get astride his course, where she would stay, which would force him to come up on her facing broadsides, while he could reply with nothing but his bow chasers. "Mr. Glaister, confirm that the quarterdeck and forecastle guns are loaded, then bows tight against the ports, which will remain closed until it is essential that they be opened. I want every man who has no need to be on deck down below, and they are to return there once they have completed any task they are called on to perform and await further orders. Mr. Collins, I want to come about onto the larboard tack now, but I want to keep changing, so as to sow doubt in the mind of our friend yonder." That, too, was carried out smoothly, then repeated onto the starboard tack, forcing the Frenchman ahead to shorten and increase sail. This while Ralph Barclay was examining the number of gun ports of the enemy frigate, which thankfully were only 2 more than his own. At least he had the satisfaction of having chosen the weaker of his 2 enemies. But what was equally obvious was that which he had hoped for was not going to be gifted to him, the notion that the man he had to face might be a fool and do something imprudent enough to allow him to get clear. The way the enemy's sails were changed suggested a degree of efficiency. "I think another drop of grog for the men might be in order. See to it." With that he went into what had been his cabin, and to the part of his desk which had been left by the stern casements, not lit by lanterns. From that he took the book which gave the private signal by which, on a daily code, one British warship could identify another. Then he stood up and, turning, looked along the main deck all the way to where the manger had been. Now it was empty. The only living creatures left were men, and they were crouched round their guns. "Shenton, a canvas sack and a round shot to weight it, if you please." "Is it that bad, your honour?" That snapped the veneer of enforced calm which Ralph Barclay had maintained, though he could not shout, given most of the crew were within earshot. "It is not your place to question me, Shenton, but to do as I bid. Now get on with it!" Unfazed, Shenton did as he was asked, this being a tone to which he was accustomed. Next, Barclay removed the ship's books, the muster, log, and those listing stores, loaded, still below, and consumed. Once Shenton was returned, he was sent off again to find the purser, with a whispered instruction to be discreet in telling him to gather his papers. That done, he took out the locked metal box that contained the ship's funds, the money a captain needed to purchase necessities where no agent of the Crown existed to grant him credit. These golden guineas and silver crowns, in several small leather pouches, he spread about his person, before going forward and below to talk to his wife. The fellow who had gashed his head was sitting on Lutyens' table, swathed in a great but untidy bandage, and Ralph Barclay was reminded that in the article of sewing and swaddling Lutyens was all thumbs. It was young Martin Dent who had the musket-ball wound. The lad had his arm in a sling and was grinning inanely, clearly having been in receipt of some potent spirit to facilitate the removal of the ball. "Which shrouds did you climb, Dent?" "Sir?" "You went up the weather shrouds, did you not? Your back close to the enemy sharpshooters, in spite of direct orders not to do so?" The sheepish hanging of the head was confirmation enough. "Damn you, boy, if you were not wounded I would flog you." "With respect, Captain Barclay," said Lutyens, "it was probably habit." "Please keep your mind on your own concerns, Mr. Lutyens, and leave me to mine." The tone of her husband's voice made Emily frown, but she got no chance to say anything because her husband took her arm and led her far enough away to talk without being overheard. "I do not wish to unduly alarm you, my dear, but I fear we, that is the ship, is in a perilous situation." Ralph Barclay experienced a moment of pride then. There was no reaction to his words, no gasps or fainting fits, not even a stiffening of his wife's body. He slipped her one of the pouches containing money. "We may escape, yet if we do there will be a bill to pay that will end up on the surgeon's table. But if we do not, be assured that the enemy officers, once you have identified yourself as my wife, will show you every kindness should we be taken." He would like to have been certain of that, but who knew what kind of ruffian might come aboard in a navy run by the sailors of the Revolution? "Take this pouch and secrete it about your person. It will provide you with the means to purchase some comfort if the worst happens." "And you, husband?" "I must be on deck, my dear, and I must, like every man aboard, hope that Providence will spare me." Seeing that she was finally showing alarm, he added quickly, "Also, there is a very good chance we will get clear, and if I can do so without too much in the way of damage, I might be able to outrun our foes. But I must first fight at least one of them to have a chance, and in battle nothing is certain." "And if they succeed?" The words that came out then were more bitter than the bile which had earlier half-filled his throat. "If the case is hopeless, I must strike our colours to prevent the useless loss of life." With that he raised her hand and kissed it, before making his way back on deck. In doing so he passed the huge bulk of Devereux, his face blackened from powder smoke. Just beyond him he had a sudden thought and turned to face him. "I have a special task for you, Devereux. My wife is in the cockpit, aiding the surgeon." "Then God bless her, your honour," Devereux replied, knuckling his narrow forehead. "We are about to take on odds of 2 to 1, and it is very likely that the enemy might try to board. If they do, and you can carry out this task, I want you to make your way to the cockpit and ensure that she is in no way molested. Will you do that?" If the deck beams had allowed it, Devereux would have raised himself an inch above his real height. "I will, sir, even if I'd rather be at your shoulder." "You will be rendering me a better service in this, Devereux." Chapter 9. What Ralph Barclay had feared was coming to pass. Poulett would do everything to stay across his bows to keep him engaged, while the Lutine, with him fully engaged, closed for the kill. He had one hope, that having withstood the broadsides on his approach to the enemy blocking his escape, he could put up his helm and deliver such a devastating rate of fire that he could blast him out of his way. That possibility depended on what damage he suffered before he could get into a range to make his superior gunnery really tell. "Enemy shortening sail, your honour!" He would have to do the same soon, and it was not just a fear of fire that prompted the need to go down to topsails. His forecourse, maincourse, and the inner and outer jibs would present a juicy target to his enemy, and if they were riddled with holes, which they surely would be if he left them set too long, they would be next to useless in a stern chase, and he would be gifted no time to bend on replacements. "We will let him try the range before we do likewise." It was as if the Poulet's commander heard him, for the side of the ship erupted, billowing smoke, and from that, arcing high in the sky, everyone on Brilliant's deck could watch the black balls as they sped towards their ship. It was a shot at long range, but the man knew he had the wind to aid him, knew that even if Ralph Barclay wanted to reply with his bow chasers, that same wind would reduce the range of his cannon. The sea in front of the prow boiled as one by one the balls dropped, great spouts of water coming up to be swept over the forecastle, soaking the gun crews crouched below the bulwarks. Glaister marked the slate, and over a minute passed before the next salvo, which told the captain of the Brilliant nothing about the enemy rate of fire. With time to spare and the range to close, his opposite number had no need to rush in reloading. Again the side of the French ship erupted, but this time all the shot did not fall into the sea. Elevation had been adjusted, the range had closed, and several balls hit the bows, which sent a shudder through the ship, to go with the noise of cracking wood as some of the flimsier parts of the timbers were rent asunder. There was a clang as the last to arrive struck the cathead and ricocheted into the anchor. "Everyone off the deck with no need to be present." That order was slow to be obeyed, no one wanting to be seen as cowardly enough to rush, until Ralph Barclay repeated it as a snarl, leaving himself, his premier, the master, Mr. Collins, the quartermaster and the 2 men on the wheel looking straight at what could well be perdition. "Mr. Collins, time the enemy shot. Mr. Glaister, try the larboard bow chaser." The order was given and the guns spoke, but the ball fell a good 100 yards short, which by Ralph Barclay's calculations meant they would have to face at least 3 more salvos before they could even hope to reply, and that with little, if any, effect. They came, aimed not at the bows now, but high at the rigging, trying to knock out his topsails and render the ship useless. Turning, Ralph Barclay looked at Lutine coming up, not quite hand over fist, for the wind did not truly favour her, but fast enough to show that escape would be nothing short of a miracle. Yet he had to believe that a miracle was possible. The enemy before him was succouring that hope by firing high at a hard-to-hit target, the masts, no more than 6 feet across at the widest point, where they went through the deck. The Frenchman was damaging the sails, but what Ralph Barclay had feared most was that the deck would be the target, which would have been likely to dismount his cannon, taking away what little hope he had of demolishing the Frenchman's own batteries. Salvo after salvo whistled through the upper works, round and chain-shot, holding the sails, parting ropes, and sending blocks falling into the overhead nettings rigged to catch them, with Ralph Barclay well aware that he would have to order the topmen aloft soon, sending them into what could be a maelstrom of shot if Poulett chose to fire a salvo of grape. He had no choice. He must get his coursers up before they suffered any more, and following on that he would need the rest of the crew on deck to man the falls and bring the ship round broadside on. The other problem was simple. Having done that, he would have little way on the ship, and that would allow Lutin to close much more quickly. "Mr. Collins, get the topmen ready at the head of the companionway. They are to go aloft as soon as the next salvo passes over, and tell them to be sharp, man. I do not want them up there for a second longer than is required." "How do we fare, sir?" asked Glaister. He was looking at the deck of Lutin, now close enough to see the figures by the wheel. Once she got within range, she would swing round, and Brilliant would be at the mercy of 2 broadsides, and only able to reply to 1. The man was looking for reassurance, hoping that his commander had some notion of how to get out of this. But Ralph Barclay had no intention of lying to him. He had erred in his appreciation and actions, leaving the outcome in little doubt, for the French had outwitted him by setting Poulett well to the west, probably anchored behind the islands of Ambier in the next deep bay between Toulon and Marseille, instead of just shielding the naval base. There would be no need for signals or lookouts. The booming sound of his cannon, as he trifled with Lutin, would do to alert her consort. "I fear we are in the steep tub, sir. I think, Mr. Glaister, you may have cause to regret not learning more French." "We will fight, sir." "Most certainly. The Royal Navy does not haul down its colours without the enemy knowing that they have been in a contest. Now, please go to the main battery and inform Mr. Bourne of what is happening, and what we need, which is the very best efforts of his gun crews." "Another discharge due, sir," said Collins, his voice low and hoarse. The anticipated salvos screamed over their heads, one taking the top foremast yard full on and splitting it like a match 10 feet from the end of the sail, only the chains holding it in place. That was followed by the yelling topmen, no doubt shouting to give themselves courage as they went aloft with the devil at their heels, up the bouncing shrouds, then stretching along the yard to haul up the main and forecourse. It was not done tidy. It didn't need to be. It had just got to be got out of the way. They took 2 salvos while they were about their task, with one man losing his foot rope to fall screaming to the deck, 2 others being blasted sideways to end up over the side. "Get that fellow off the deck! All hands to man the falls, then the guns, and get a couple of hatch covers over the side to those men in the water." That was a forlorn hope. Few sailors could swim, while the chance of landing something to keep them afloat close enough to save them was slim, and that was without knowing if they were wounded. Yet it was better to do what he had asked, just to reassure those still on deck. "Quartermaster!" Ralph Barclay shouted over the sound of yet another salvo, and as soon as the yards were freed. Slowly HMS Brilliant swung round, and while that was happening the already loaded guns were being loosed off, the gun ports opened and the muzzles run out. "Steady, lads! I want a broadside and damn the timbers! You are all to fire as one on my command!" It was an agony, waiting for HMS Brilliant to come round, the bowsprit swinging so slowly that Ralph Barclay feared it would never get there. He had his arm raised, this while every gun captain waited, standing well back from his piece with a long lanyard to the flintlock. He waited until the deck was level on the swell, but dropping, for what he was about to do would lift the whole ship slightly. His arm dropped, and the side of the ship erupted, sending a shockwave through the timbers that the captain suspected would mightily strain the frame. It was worth the risk, for the result was gratifying as half the side of the Poulett towards the stern disintegrated. Over the water came the sound of clanging metal, that of guns dismounted, and the screams that followed as the dislodged splinters did their work. Not that the men who had caused this mayhem paid any attention. They were too busy reloading, and in just over half a minute the first of Barclay's cannon began to fire once more into the smoke of their own guns, a black cloud which was billowing over them. That was the point at which Lutin joined the contest, not yet with her full armament, but enough of her forward cannon to do damage, and this time they were aimed at deck level. Now it was the turn of HMS Brilliant to suffer from smashed bulwarks, that while the higher shots screamed across the deck at body height, cutting a pair of hands in half as it blasted apart the fire engine. Poulette was still firing, but not with the same venom, and once the smoke had cleared, Ralph Barkley could see that the enemy quarterdeck was empty, with the wheels smashed, and not only their bulwark on their beam gone, but that on the other side as well. "They cannot manoeuvre!" he shouted, pointing to the absence of a wheel. "Mr. Collins, get some damned weight on this ship!" Then to his premier, "We must get broadside on to Lutine as well, otherwise she will destroy us." The proof of that statement came with the next salvo from that quarter, which did to Brilliant something similar to that which she had done to the Poulette, though it was the forecastle which was swept and not the quarterdeck. 2 cannon forward were dismounted, their crews pulped either by the shot or their own weapon, one of which had been blasted onto its side, while the other was hanging onto its lashing by a single rope. "Secure those cannon! Get those wounded men below! Gunners below, reload and fire as you bear!" Now it was Lutine on the receiving end once more, but that left Brilliant bows on again to what was left of Poulette's main battery. There was no coordination, but the 2 French vessels were firing at intervals. That meant the British deck was repeatedly swept, half the time by grape-shot. The trio of ships was now so close that musket fire was pouring in, not aimed, for that was impossible on a swell, but just as deadly if the man firing got lucky. It was one of those that did for Ralph Barkley, a small ball of lead that seared across his brow, hitting enough bone to stun him. He dropped to his knees as Glaister rushed to him, the voice asking about his state like an echo in a distant chamber, as were the words to get the captain below. 2 sailors, one of them Devereux, carried him to a now full cockpit, where Lutyens and his wife were working flat out to stem the flow of blood from wounds, or to stifle the cries of badly wounded men with doses of laudanum and rum. Already the tub by the surgeon's table had in it cut-off limbs. Devereux called that the captain needed attention, and he ignored the headshake from Lutyens, busy sawing off a man's leg. The bully sat Ralph Barkley on the edge of the operating table and insisted that he be attended to. All of this heard by the patient, but in a way that made him feel as if he was not present. There was blood in his eyes and on his tongue, and even his own voice sounded ethereal as he said, "I must return to the deck." Lutyens' loblolly boy forced back his captain's head and poured neat rum down his throat, which made him gag. He was unaware of his own wife as she threw a thin strip of bandage round his head and pulled it tight in an attempt to stem the bleeding. This while her partially recovered spouse was trying to get to his feet. "Stay still, husband, stay still." That voice penetrated, and he stood swaying while the bandage was applied and secured. His head felt like a ton weight, but he knew he must get back on deck, for a decision had to be made, one which fell to him, as long as he could think straight, whether to strike his colours or keep fighting. "Devereux, get me up there, even if you have to carry me." A strong arm was under his, and that aided him in walking, or rather staggering, towards the companionway. Devereux had to practically lift him to get him up the 2 sets of stairways to the quarterdeck, but he did manage, and they emerged to a maelstrom of noise, death, and destruction. Even through hard-to-focus eyes, Ralph Barkley could see his ship was in desperate straits, with fully half his guns dismounted or slewed away from the ports, bodies everywhere, and both off his bows and his quarter the ghostly ships closing to board through the dense smoke. The thought then was not of his ship, but of his wife. If a fight started on this deck, who knew where it would end? Who knew what kind of undisciplined fellow would get to the cockpit first? Ralph Barkley staggered across the deck to where Glaister stood, hatless, his face blackened and one arm hanging loose with blood dripping from his fingers, his sword in the other. The way his premier looked at him showed some appreciation of the horror he had witnessed. There was no thirst for glory in those pale eyes now, just as there was no one on what remained of the wheel. Aloft the rigging was in tatters, his topsails ragged, while the mainmast above the cap was leaning, only kept in place by the backstays. The situation was hopeless. Even if those gunners that could reload and fire were still doing so, the means of escape in both men and canvas was diminishing by the second. "Strike the colours, Mr. Glaister. Collins, the sack with the private signal book over the side, if you please." Glaister stared at him without moving, until Ralph Barclay took the sword from his hand, passed it to Devereux, and ordered him onto the poop to cut the colours down from the mizzenmast. Collins was on the side furthest from the Frenchman, dropping the weighted canvas sack into the sea. "Cease firing!" Ralph Barclay yelled, an act which sent a searing pain through his head. It was a feeble imitation of the sound he was normally wont to make, so feeble that it had an effect only on those closest to him. It was more the cheering from the enemy decks which told his crew that the fight was over and lost, that and the way their fire slackened. Then, apart from that cheering, there was relative silence. No more deadly balls or grape shot, no more musket fire, and as the smoke was blown clear, Ralph Barclay could see that he had acted just in time, for the deck of the Lutine, not more than 10 feet from his own, was crowded with armed men just waiting for the ships to collide so they could board. They did come together, the Frenchman having braced his yards round to make it possible, and the enemy crowded over, led by a fellow in a sky-blue coat. But the command to cease fire had taken effect, and no one sought to challenge him. Making his way to the quarterdeck, he approached Ralph Barclay and bowed, as Devereux returned the sword to his captain's hand. "Capitaine de frégate Hippolyte Monceau à votre service." His opposite number touched the blood-stained bandage round his head. "Captain Ralph Barclay, of His Britannic Majesty's frigate Brilliant." "Parlez-vous français, capitaine?" "Non. Malheureusement, je ne parle pas anglais." "Someone fetch Mrs. Barclay." The two men, as well as the two crews, stood eyeing each other while they waited, the Frenchman's eyes lifting as Emily emerged onto the deck, her apron and hands covered in blood. "Please, my dear, tell this fellow who I am, the name of the ship, and that I am surrendering my sword to avoid further bloodshed." As Emily spoke, he held the weapon out, secretly pleased that it was Glaister's and not his own. The whole French fleet cheered as the trio of frigates sailed into Toulon, HMS Brilliant between her captors, the tricolour above the blue pennant that denoted the rank of the commanding admiral under which she sailed. The Poulette was in a sorrier state than her capture, being steered by relieving tackles and commanded by sous-officiers, its wheel and most commissioned members of the company having been swept away. If they noticed that the damage to all three was great, it did nothing to temper their joy. That might have happened had they been able to see below, where they would have found that all three main decks were now extended sick bays, that is, where they were not occupied by those already dead. Captain Monceau had been all courtesy, and it transpired he had been an officer in the old Marine Royale, though a lieutenant, not a captain. While he had insisted that the captured crew must remain below, with musket-bearing guards on the companionways, he had, before returning to his own quarterdeck, leaving a lieutenant in charge, ordered that the main cabin be put back into some semblance of order, so that both Ralph Barclay and his wife could, once the wounded were treated, wash, change their clothes, and make themselves presentable in some privacy. Prior to carrying out her own toilette, Emily cleaned and redressed her husband's wound, where a chunk of flesh had been removed from his brow just below the line of his hair. The wardroom likewise had been restored, and in that lay Glaister with an arm broken by a musket ball and a couple of wounded midshipmen and master's mates. The cook was allowed to light his coppers so the men could be fed, and the Frenchman had shown no desire to interfere with the dispensation of their rum ration. Naturally, he asked for the ship's papers, but showed neither surprise nor a hint of anger when he was informed that the private signals had been disposed of. That was a captain's duty in any navy. Nor did he object when Ralph Barclay asked to address the men, and to talk to those wounded who could communicate. He, with Emily alongside, walked down a line of injured sailors laying on the deck, some with wounds that would heal, others maimed so they would never serve again. It was in the eyes that they saw those who would probably expire, that dull look of men prepared to give up the fight. Emily especially tried very hard to lift the spirits of those fellows in a way that her husband envied.
Try as he might, his sympathy was tempered by the thought of how his actions would be received by higher authority. He had lost his ship, but to superior odds, and Britannia was inclined to make heroes of men who suffered such a defeat, seeing it as glorious. The Admiralty, however, might take a different view, and demand to know why his ship had been put at risk in the first place. "The bill is heavy, Mr. Lutyens." The surgeon was tired, his eyes red-rimmed, for he had not stopped tending those who needed his care. "I will give it to you in writing when I have time." "Captain Monceau has assured me that they have an excellent naval infirmary in the port. He will have us alongside the quay so they can be transferred with as little disturbance as possible." "With your permission, I will go with them." "Granted, and my wife and I will visit as soon as they let us." "Mr. Sykes!" "Sir," replied a dispirited boatswain, who was at least unwounded. "When we get ashore, the officers, warrants, and men will be separated. I am putting you in charge of the seamen, and I have spoken to the purser, and he has agreed to dispense what tobacco he has, though he must, for his own sake, put it against your names. That you must see to right away before we dock, or the Frenchmen ashore will surely steal it." "Sir." "I have funds to purchase necessities, but they are limited. It is my hope our captors will feed us without payment, but should they not do so, direct them to me. And Sykes, no man is to be allowed to volunteer to serve the enemy, no matter how bad conditions become." "Can I assure them of an exchange, Your Honour?" "You can certainly encourage the belief that it might happen, but I think you know as well as I do that our own navy must have something with which to bargain." "Captain Barclay?" Ralph Barclay turned to see the Lieutenant Monceau had left in charge. The man was looking at Emily, which was natural, since she had to translate. What was less acceptable was the obvious delight he took in doing so. "Would you be so good as to join me on deck? Admiral de Trogoff's barge is coming alongside with the military commander as well, and he and his staff will want to be presented to you and your wife." Emily saw the pain in her husband's eye, for this was likely to be a humiliating experience, even if the French officers sought to make it as painless as possible. She took his arm and whispered in his ear, "Remember, husband, you are a hero. You have fought hard and lost honourably. The Admiral and the other French officers, with the exception of Captain Monceau, are mere mortals." Chapter 10. Dysart woke Fairmellow as soon as the bird-song began, picking up on the first sign of pre-dawn eastern light, it being time to get back out to sea. The cutter was hauled up onto the beach with a line to a pine-tree trunk to make sure it remained there. It was Dysart who had insisted that staying at sea at night, when "they couldna see their bloody hands in front of their faces," was a daft notion of the kind only an indifferent captain, snug in his ain cabin with a wife to comfort him, would have burdened them with. Fairmellow had not assented the first night, but 10 hours of darkness and fitful sleep in an open and uncomfortable boat, with one man tasked to stay awake as lookout, was obviously stupid when that same lookout could see nothing of any import unless the moon was near full and not covered by cloud. Quite apart from the aches where the wood had indented their bodies, the sole result of trying to stay on station had been to find that they had drifted miles off, and that it took 2 hours after dawn to get back to approximately the position from which they had been dropped off from Brilliant, and from which they were supposed to pick up Barclay's signal. The advantages to being ashore were greater than just a decent night's sleep. It was possible to light a fire and cook their own food, and once they had found a source of water, they could drink as much as they pleased, welcome after a broiling day at sea. If anyone local had spotted them, even if they had come to investigate, all they would observe was a group of sailors doing what such men did, for there was nothing to denote their nationality. Dysart was of the opinion that they wouldn't care. Most folk, he asserted, were like those the world over, content to mind their own business if what seemed odd had no bearing on their existence, and if they did seek to alert authority, it would be in daylight, when they would be gone from the beach.
Fairmillow woke slowly, lost in a lubricious dream of the type to which lads of his age were only too prone. That had him moving quickly, once he was upright, to relieve himself in the water lapping the shore, the gentle waves pleasant on his bare feet. By the time he was done, the rest of the men had been roused, and Dysart was using the increasing light to extinguish all trace of their presence. The now cold ash from the fire, and any impressions in the sands that spoke of human existence. When they landed again that night, it would be on a different part of the beach that edged a cliff-enclosed bay at least a mile long. The cask of fresh water was loaded into the cutter. The mast stepped, and they pushed off, sure of which course to set, that being the reverse of the previous night, looking for a fishing boat that might provide them with something with which to breakfast. There were, as usual, dozens of them out at sea, boats which had set off in darkness to get to their favourite ground and claim it for their own, each one with a permanently boiling tub of food, part of which they were happy to sell, for once they had a catch it would be replenished. After 4 days, and with no sight of their mothership on the horizon to tell them if the French fleet had sailed, the atmosphere had become relaxed, almost soporific, with everyone taking a turn on the tiller, while the rest used the shade of the sail to stay out of the sun. "Holy Christ!" cried Dysart. "Look lively, there is a ship in the offing, and if I'm no mistaken it's Firefly." Fairmillow, grabbing the mast, pulled himself up and shaded his eyes, his voice, when he spoke, larded with anxiety. "You're right, Dysart, and there's another ship with her, and we are not where we are supposed to be. Barclay will have me kissing the gunner's daughter." "Christ almighty, Captain Gould doesna ken that, sir, so I shouldn't go worrying about it. All we has to do is tell him what it is we know, and he'll be cock-a-hoop. But I should get your shoes and blue coat on. You didn't want to be seen in a state of undress." There was no sitting in the shade now. It was all hands to look dutiful, even if, with the course too close set and the mast hauled round to take the wind and hold it, there was nothing left to do now. Low in the water, and in a seascape dotted with fishing smacks, it took some time for the lookout on HMS Firefly to spot them, and that only when Fairmillow, in his blue coat and now stained breeches, had stood on the gunwale to wave in a furious attempt to attract attention. Both ships backed their sails and rode on the swell as the cutter closed. The first voice they heard, that of Davidge Gould, calling over the side. "Is that you, Mr. Fairmillow?" "It is, sir. Where is Captain Barclay?" It was a garbled account that came out, but it was complete by the time they came alongside, not knowing how relieved was Gould, who, on being told of the approach of the cutter and seeing the midshipman in command of it, had half feared that HMS Brilliant might have been taken or destroyed. He was moved to near elation when told that not only was the French fleet preparing for sea, but that the youngster had a list of the ships and their armament. "Mr. Fairmillow, to my cabin at once. I must write a dispatch for Lord Hood." "He has taken command, sir?" asked Fairmillow, before blushing at the look engendered by that statement of the obvious. Gould wrote swiftly, listing the enemy ships from Fairmillow's notes, wondering why, with this information on such a powerful fleet, Ralph Barclay had not sought out the Admiral to alert him. But then he reminded himself that in the time they had spent sailing together he had never quite fathomed Barclay, so it was no surprise he did not do so now. All he knew was what he would have done, while acknowledging that he had certainty of the relative proximity of the fleet. Hood was making good progress, but it was not as swift as it could be, mainly owing to the inability of the Spanish to keep station on their British allies, if the latter put on a press of sail. But with news like this, Hood, always by reputation aggressive, would almost certainly have sent ahead a couple of line of battleships, the swiftest sailors, to close Toulon with all dispatch, ships strong enough to look into the port and brush aside any frigate that tried to stop them. Much as he was dying to ask the boy now drinking his wine about Ralph Barclay's motives, that was a conversation he could not have with a midshipman, lest he let slip in his inquiry that he found those actions questionable. "Mr. Fairmillow, finish your wine and go below to the mid's berth. You know where that is, I trust?" The answer was a reluctantly acknowledged yes, he and Brilliant's mids having got drunk on a visit at Lisbon. Their hosts from Firefly had been liberal with the wine before the entire party went ashore and caused as much mayhem as young bucks do when they are full of drink and in a foreign port. Several ladies of Lisbon had had their skirts tweaked, and those local youths who had tried to stop them had been forced to retire after a good bout of fisticuffs, carrying off those that were too knocked about to walk. It was a happy memory, marred only by the punishments inflicted by their superiors for upsetting the nation's Portuguese allies. "Get yourself some clean linen off of one of my lads and a pair of breeches that do not stink of fish. And for God's sake, wash that face of yours, it is filthy." That made Gould look really closely. "It is time, too, that you started shaving." Fermelo rubbed the soft blonde down on his chin, pleased to feel the odd stiff bristle. "You are to go aboard my consort, HMS Tormore, and carry this dispatch to Lord Hood." "Thank you, sir." Gould had thought about sending one of his own mids, but that, he reasoned, would be unfair. It was Berkeley who had discovered the state of affairs, so it was only fitting that one of his youngsters should gather what credit was going for making it known to the C&C. Back on deck, the cutter had been emptied and sent astern, her crew standing about the deck. Gould emerged from his cabin and gave the orders for HMS Tormore to close. When Fermelo appeared 20 minutes later, he was rubbing a freshly shaved chin and dressed in a clean shirt and stock and a fresh pair of breeches. This while ropes were being thrown from Tormore to haul her alongside, with Gould in deep conversation over the bulwarks with her commander. Fermelo was handed the dispatch, safely sealed in an oilskin pouch, with Gould peering again at his face, nodding with satisfaction to see a clean chin. "Try and stay presentable till you meet the Admiral, Mr. Fermelo, for if you turn up in his cabin as filthy as you did in mine, he'll masthead you. Now say good-bye to your men." Dysart was the only one who spoke, the other three just knuckling their foreheads. "Look after yourself, laddie, which I had to say, nature has not geared you for." The smile took the sting out of the words, and Fermelo patted him on the shoulder to show he was not offended. Then he leapt up and jumped aboard Tormore, which cast off immediately. "Boatswain!" Gould shouted, pointing at Fermelo's men. "Get the ratings of these fellows. I will order the watch and station bills to accommodate them until we make contact with their own ship." "And here's me," moaned Dysart, "thinking we were going to get a wee bit of a bloody breather." Captain McGann did no more than touch at Lisbon, dropping off mail for the British resident there, picking up the return post, establishing the fact that Hood's fleet was long gone, first to Cadiz, then to Cartagena in the Mediterranean, to rendezvous with the rest of the Spaniards. Gibraltar he raised in 7 days' sailing. The first sight of the great rock and the narrow channel it controlled, not forgetting the proximity of the Spanish mainland to the north, made it easy to understand its importance. Nothing could sail in and out of the inland sea without risk from the ships based there. Dressing in his best uniform to go ashore, hands smelling of turpentine where he had rubbed them to remove traces of tar, Pearce felt a slight sadness, for he had enjoyed the voyage and the company aboard the postal packet. Even in such a short time he had learned a great deal about everything to do with the sailing of a ship, for McGann had undertaken no change or action with which his passenger was not involved, and he and his crew were patience personified when it came to explanation. He now knew a buntlin from a clewlin, and which on the lawn ran to which belaying pin, a becket from a grommet, how to find his latitude, though a precise fixing of his longitude was a very hit and more likely miss affair. He understood something of sails and their functions, as well as the fact that less aloft could often produce more speed, that any sail plan was a balance of the force of the wind on the canvas it touched and the run of the sea through which they were travelling. There were 1,000 other small facts to add to what he had already learnt aboard navy ships, about what was a very complex instrument of movement, one that looked so simple from afar. McGann had talked about the sea they sailed through as though it was a living, breathing thing. He seemed to know every current from the Channel through Biscay to the coast of Iberia, where water was slack and when, and what tides at what time would make for a swifter passage, and, just as important, those that would impede him. He talked of variable winds caused by the heat of the land and the cold of the sea, of the general irregularity of the breezes, however steady they seemed, which called for constant attention to sails and course if a ship was to get the best out of it. In truth, he imparted so much that John Pearce doubted he would remember it all. "I wish you Godspeed and the hope that Providence will keep you safe." Peering a little closer at the roly-poly captain, Pearce reckoned he saw a wetting round the eyes and was touched. "And I hope that you will think kindly of me and my lads." "Always, Mr. McGann," Pearce replied truthfully. They were all on deck now that the packet was moored, waiting to shake him by the hand, and Pearce had to admit that the parting made him too a little lachrymose. It came to him then that the lawn had been like a home to him, a brief one, but a place that had given him that rare thing in his life, a feeling of belonging. His sea-chest loaded into the boat with the containers of post, and being rowed ashore, he reflected on that, wondering if he would ever be settled, if he would ever cease to move around, and one day put down roots. Given the task he had set himself, it looked unlikely that such a thing would happen in the immediate future. The Rock of Gibraltar, the peak surrounded by a single cloud, was a crowded place, not only by its indigenous inhabitants and the navy, but by soldiers permanently placed there for defence, a fact made obvious to Pearce in the short walk he took from the landing stage to the Port Admiral's house. The place bristled with gun emplacements and redoubts, redcoats and blue. Taken from Spain in 1702, the Dons had never renounced their claim to it as their territory, and had indeed tried to retake it more than once, the last attempt just over 10 years previously. Ownership had become to them an obsession. Looking out of the Port Admiral's window, he could see the narrow isthmus that connected the rock with the shore, open now, but so enfiladed with cannon that it could be turned into a death trap at a moment's notice. "Damned odd seeing old Langara sail by in company with Hood," said the lieutenant who had been detailed to look after Pearce, this while the Admiral's clerk perused his orders. "Couldn't anchor, of course. Would never do to let a Don Admiral set foot on the blessed rock. We might never shift the sod." "Did HMS Leander dock here?" asked Pearce. The lieutenant nodded. "A week ago, or was it 8 days, to make up a water. Captain got a cold welcome from the Admiral, and a sharp command to get back to sea and catch up with Lord Hood. But he would not do that without he made an excursion to the mainland. Ask me, they only touched to arrange a boxing bout with the army. Brought with him a fine bruiser of a fellow, an Irishman, who might make his mark if he took to it proper. He wasn't just good, he was clever with it. The Leanders cleaned out the bullocks, who naturally backed their trooper." "This Irishman, did he have a name?" "Oh, something or other. Don't they all? Can't quite recall, to be precise. Seemed a bit slow at first, but he was just biding his time. Got going once the army fellow retired and knocked him out cold. Not that he got off light. Took him an hour to finish it, and he took punishment in the process. I doubt he was much use for duty once they were back at sea." "You watched it?" "The whole island did, and thank God I knew one of Leander's officers, for if I had not, I would have backed Braddock." "Who is—" "The army's man. What a lump he was. Still is, I suppose. And hard with it. I don't think I've ever seen a back with so many lash scars." "This Irishman, was he a big man with dark curly hair, blue eyes in a square sort of head?" "Well, that describes him. Do you think you know the fellow?" The calling of his name killed any reply. He turned to see the Admiral's writing clerk holding his orders. The pouch containing the dispatches from Pitt was still in his pocket. "The Admiral's instructions. You are to go aboard HMS Tartar, which is at present preparing to weigh to join Lord Hood. Since your duty is to carry dispatches to him from London, the Admiral would be obliged if you would undertake the same duty for him." Agreement was mandatory, but when he and his sea-chest arrived aboard HMS Tartar, Pearce was given some understanding of the word preparing. Certainly the frigate was about to sail. She was fully loaded with what stores she needed, but there seemed no immediacy to the notion. Indeed, the officers who greeted him to the wardroom, barring one on anchor watch, were preparing to go ashore, and since the new arrival had no duties, they insisted he accompany them, a night out that introduced John Pearce to the flesh-pots of the rock. Everything about the place was designed to cater for the military, and it was hinted to Pearce that should he, later on, have any unusual proclivities, they could be satisfied, that the frigate's officers knew where to go for shows with naked ladies and bestial displays with animals. "The Dons might be papists," said one, "and cursed to suffer eternal damnation, but by damn they are more loose than any Anglican I have ever met." He was quick to assert that food and drink were sufficient, and paid no special attention to the young senoritas that came to sing songs in Spanish at their table. Nor did he at first pay any attention to a row brewing behind him. That was until he heard the unmistakable, though clearly drunken voice of Captain McGann. When he turned, it was to see the tubby little man, flushed with drink, dressed in his best finery, a velvet coat and a lace ruff, the whole under a big feather-edged hat, swaying before an army officer whose face was as red as his coat. There was no sign of any of his crew. "You fail to understand, sir," McGann slurred, "that the lady has taken a shine to my person." "And you, blackguard, have failed to take account of the fact that the lady you refer to is my wife." "A trifling distinction, sir, and no doubt an error the lady regrets." The lady in question was attractive, certainly, but no real beauty, although she did have her gown cut low to reveal an ample bosom that was perilously close to McGann's nose. She looked mortified, and was tugging at her husband's arm to pull him away. Pearce swung round, stood up and closed with the trio, taking McGann's arm and spinning him round. "Captain McGann, how pleased I am to see you. Pray come and join us. I'm with a party of naval officers." "Pearce, just the fellow!" McGann cried, pulling so hard that both men now faced the beetroot-red army officer. "Please explain to this poltroon that he is encroaching upon my preserve, that he best be off and leave me to this lady who, I might add, would, I'm sure, be most happy to have you attend our forthcoming nuptials. She's a fine-looking filly, too, wouldn't you say?" A swift elbow in the ribs hurt. "Bet you'd like to better yourself, you young rogue." "Damn!" The redcoat got no further, as Pearce spoke in a conciliatory voice. "Pray ignore him, sir. You can see he is seriously in drink, and I am told by his crew that this is a state he often gets into, and that he will wake on the morrow full of mortification at his behaviour." That was when the army officer slapped McGann hard, knocking his hat off while shouting, "He will not, sir! If I have my way, he will wake in the morning to take a lead ball in his brain!" Pearce should have continued to play the peacemaker, should have accepted that McGann, in being struck so hard, was only getting his due, for he had been rude to the point of absurdity, and being drunk was hardly enough of an excuse. What prompted him instead to thump the army officer back and knock him sprawling over a table he was afterwards at a loss to explain, except that in the short voyage he had become close to this older man, who had even gone so far as to play the father with him. It was unfitting that a younger, fitter fellow should strike a person of McGann's age. Suddenly all the Tartar's officers were at his side, this while every redcoat in the room was reaching for some weapon with which to fight. Bottles began to fly, that followed by fists, and soon the entire tavern was in turmoil, women screaming, those singing señoritas at the highest pitch, as folk with no attachment to either service got involved. Pearce was in the thick of it, throwing punches right and left, painfully fending off a blow aimed with a chair leg, wondering how he had got into this, when a hand on his collar dragged him back, ranks closing in front of him. He spun, fist up, to find himself looking at McGann's crew, two of whom were lifting their captain off the wooden boards. "We lost him, your honour!" shouted young Harry over the din of the fight. "Sneaky bugger that he is!" "Get him out of here now," Pearce shouted, "before he gets himself killed." The Premier of the Tartar had detached himself from the mayhem, and was shouting at him as McGann's men complied. "You get out of here too, Pearce, for if that bullock comes to, you'll be obliged to duel with him in the morning. Get back to the ship and stay there." "Run away?" "Yes, and that, Mr. Pearce, is an order. Now go." HMS Tartar sailed at dawn the following morning. If Mr. Fremantle, the captain who had come from his cabin to supervise the act,
wondered why all of his deck officers were showing facial bruising and were moving exceedingly stiffly to boot, he did not inquire. He merely gave the orders, and they were obeyed. In the wardroom, Lieutenant John Pearce, with nothing to do in the way of duty, was enjoying a leisurely breakfast, listening to the creaking of the timbers as they began to strain against wind and tide, happy, for more than one reason, to be on his way again. Chapter 11. Ralph and Emily Barclay found themselves accommodated in a comfortable three-roomed apartment in the higher reaches of the Grosse Tour de Mitre, a moated medieval tower overlooking, from the ramparts, the Grande Rade and the inner roadstead called the Petite Rade, that made Toulon a perfect naval anchorage. Slightly further off, they could observe what the French called the Vieux d'Ars, the heavily fortified harbour, large enough to support an entire fleet, that also housed dry docks, the arsenal, and all the buildings from admiral's quarters to that of the lowly saw-pit worker. Servants had been provided, and all their possessions and papers, including Emily's cushions and unfinished embroidery, had been brought to them, and Lutyens had given Emily the means, clean bandages and some evil-smelling white spirit of German extraction, to keep treating her husband's now healing head wound. His officers, midshipmen, the master and his mates, along with the fat little purser, were in the guard-room, less salubrious quarters on the ground floor, while the crew, at least those not wounded, were in the lower chambers, not dungeons exactly, but what had been storerooms 2 centuries earlier, when the Tour de Mitre had been of some use as a defensive bastion. They were neither damp nor cold at this time of year, but the chambers were certainly not comfortable, and as an added affliction were much prone to invasion by vermin. Included in that was Shenton, who had complained bitterly at the denigration, as had Railton the gunner, though on behalf of his wife, the only other woman on the ship apart from Emily Barclay. At least that had produced a result. Mrs. Railton had been moved to help the surgeon. Looking past the ships readying to weigh was the infirmary, where Lutyens, with French help, was trying to nurse back to health those who had not expired in the recent action. The bill was heavy, over 35 dead already, with those who cared for the survivors shaking their heads over a dozen more, all listed on a sheet of paper laying on the elegant Louis XV table alongside the report Ralph Barclay had written on the action. There were men he knew on that list, as well as names on which he had to stretch his memory to recall a face. Lemuel Hale, his coxswain, a man who had served with him for many years, even when he had no ship, who had been a reliable informant on the furtive actions of the crew, seemed like a personal loss. Ridley, one of the boatswain's mates, he could not recall ever having spoken to. The quartermaster and his men on the wheel had expired as a group while he was being attended to below. Had he been on deck, he might have gone with them, which brought, for a brief second, the thought that such a glorious death might be preferable to captivity. A midshipman had perished as well, which would occasion a sad letter to his family. There had been a sprinkling of French coves in the crew, taken from a corsair he had captured, but he had sent them off as part of a prize crew, which was just as well for them, for they would not have been greeted kindly by their fellow countrymen if captured. The enemy had endured a heavier cost, perhaps twice as many deceased and, of course, a corresponding number wounded, which was something. The quarterdeck of Poulette had suffered especially, and though not told directly, Ralph Barclay had been in receipt of enough hints to know that there were several officers' wives who were now widows, and several children who would grow up without a father. "Naturally, Captain Barclay, we would ask for your parole, but once given I can see no reason why you and your wife cannot come and go as you please during daylight hours, provided you are escorted. I regret that unless invited out for a specific purpose, you must suffer a curfew that debars you the hours of darkness." The speaker was Capitaine de Vaisseau le Baron d'Ambert, a long-serving and aristocratic officer of the French Navy, an English speaker who exuded both a charm and a courtesy that his British counterpart had thought gone from this country, following on from the Revolution. Of medium height, with a face marked by smallpox, he was not handsome, but wearing his wig, his braided uniform, and his manners, he was like a creature from another age.
Indeed, Ralph Barclay had been amazed to find such people still serving, but it seemed that Toulon, so far from Paris, had yet to be cleansed of royalist officers. The commanding admiral was Le Comte de Trogoff de Querecy, and on first meeting him and his officers, all displaying the same qualities as d'Ambert, it had seemed as if the upheavals of 1789 had never happened. While it was a good thing on the whole, it had one downside. A fleet of ships commanded by men of experience, instead of those politically elevated, would be a harder opponent to face. "You are most kind, Captain d'Imbert. I will, of course, need to see to the care of my men." "Naturally, monsieur. As is the practice, your sailors will be put to some form of labour, and thus justify their being fed. With the wounded, there is a boat available to take you across to the infirmary at any time of your choosing. I am also commanded to ask if you and your wife will consent to join Admiral Le Comte de Trogoff for dinner today." "Delighted, sir," replied Ralph Barclay, with an enthusiasm that was mirrored by a look of doubt on his wife's face. "Then I will take my leave," said the Baron. "A carriage will be sent for you at 6 this evening. Should you wish for anything, please do not hesitate to ask one of the servants." As d'Ambert exited, Ralph Barclay spoke in a rather sly fashion. "And to think, my dear, I was worried we might get our throats cut." Emily's reply was quite terse. "It seems we will be filling our bellies instead, husband." "You object?" "I wonder at the propriety. To break bread with those you have so recently been trying to kill." "Let us call it chivalrous, the notion, which I wonder survives, that once a battle is over we revert from the barbaric to the civilized. Were the positions reversed, I would entertain the French officers, and I suspect you would be happy to do so as well." "Forgive me, husband. I did not understand." "No forgiveness is required." "We will be visiting the infirmary?" asked Emily. "The crew's quarters first, then the wounded." As Emily went to change into something more fitting, Ralph Barclay went out onto the ramparts and stood as if he was examining the fleet before him. Really, he was ruminating again on his own recent actions, most tellingly that dispatch laying on the table and how it would be perceived by higher authority, his mind swaying from a positive outcome to disgrace and back again. Walking to another part, he could see HMS Brilliant just inside the Vieux d'Ars, tied up to a quay by the long buildings that housed the fleet workshops. Already there were shipwrights aboard, working to repair the damage, with a heavily craned flatboat alongside taking out the damaged topmast prior to seating home a replacement. He knew that very little harm had been done below the waterline, so it would not take these workers long to get her ready for sea. She would be renamed, of course, and he felt his heart miss a beat as he contemplated that. It was not a feeling for the ship, but for himself, for no fellow officer of his could ever see her without recognition, also remembering at the same time the name of the captain who had lost her. They called on the officers first. Glaister with his broken arm in a sling, Lieutenant Bourne II, who had a bandaged head where a splinter had narrowly missed giving him a mortal wound. The youngsters quiet, having lost any temptation to lark about as they contemplated the fate of being captured seamen of low standing. Compared to the Barclays' accommodation, the guard-room was a dark, cool affair. For being so low, there were only barred, narrow embrasures to let in air and light. Likewise, the furnishing was plain, unlike that on the floor he had. A pine table and chairs, with straw-filled mattresses on cots ranged around the walls. "We are all anxious to know what will become of us, sir," asked Glaister. "I will try to find out tonight, Mr. Glaister. My wife and I are to dine with Admiral de Trogoff." It was a tactless thing to say, evident on the faces of those imprisoned in the room, but Ralph Barclay did not observe it. "It is an invitation we cannot refuse, Mr. Glaister," said Emily, who did. "I have no idea," Barclay continued, vaguely aware of a chill in the atmosphere, "what the arrangements are for naval prisoners, or should I say officers. Are they the same as in King Louis's time? Let us hope they are, gentlemen, and that some action had occurred in which Britannia has been triumphant, for then we will soon be exchanged." It was nonsense, and all present except the youngsters should know it. Many a captured officer in previous wars had spent years incarcerated in a dingy fortress far from any coast, forced to eke out an existence without funds, unless someone from home had enough to send them money to buy from their jailers. Escape was near impossible. How could any prisoner cross a country like France, even when it was a monarchy, with its numerous customs posts, active gendarmerie, and a need for fluent French? Given the nature of the revolution and the suspicion it clearly generated, that must now be even more difficult. "I must go to see to the crew," he said to his juniors. "Believe me, you are better off than they. I have set some of the men to catching the rats that are already in these chambers, and others to block off the points of entry." Sykes was walking the Barclays around the basement. Triangular storerooms that had once housed powder, grain, and water enough to withstand a siege, with the captain and his wife exchanging encouraging words with a crew that sat listlessly round the walls. "What we cannot do, Captain, is stop the scorpions, which are bad, seeing as we are sleeping on the ground." The thought of that, of a crawling creature which could invade at night and go where it pleased, even across the face of a sleeping individual, made Emily shudder. She would have had an even more telling reaction if Sykes had gone on to tell of the other vermin they faced: beetles, cockroaches, centipedes, and the odd snake. "Has anyone been stung?" "No, sir. I will speak to the surgeon about it, and our captors. Any man suffering from a sting should be sent to the infirmary right away. I will see if I can get you some timber to knock up cots, and tubs for water to put the legs in. Nothing discourages vermin like water. At least you will be out of here during daylight hours. We are to be put to labour. The French will not feed you otherwise." There were inquiries about the food they had been given till now, which Sykes stated was adequate without being what the men were accustomed to. General health, with an admonition to take advantage of the ample antiscorbutics that were available in this warm climate to ward off any hint of scurvy. Sykes was given some funds, with strict instructions to use them sparingly, money with which to bribe the guards to provide additions to the rations they were receiving, most particularly tobacco, which was disappearing at a prodigious rate. "And set the men to work making traps that can be left to do their work when you are not present." "None of the men asked about their future, husband," said Emily when they were in the boat being rowed across to the Grande Rade. "Is that not odd?" "You will find among the common seamen that they accept their fate, my dear. After all, what have they got ashore that is so much better? Besides, they too have the prospect of an exchange. If Hotham can take a French ship, he will send in a cartel to arrange it, their sailors and officers for ours." "And us?" "It will need an officer of equal or superior rank." Ralph Barclay patted his wife's hand then. "But fear not, while we are in their care we will be treated with all courtesy, I'm sure." "Marseille has risen, and I am told the sentiments in the town are much the same. If there are radicals here, they are not of the Jacobin faction which has taken power in Paris. There are meetings going on nightly with most of the wealthier citizens of Toulon, and certainly the delegates to the local assembly, insisting that they should join with Marseille and declare the whole of Provence free." "Who told you this, Mr. Lutyens?" They were walking through the naval hospital, past open windows which let in much air and sunlight, something brilliant surgeon had insisted upon for his own patients, much to the bemusement of his French counterparts, who agreed, only on condition that they were closed before dusk to keep out insects who would be attracted by the lanterns. Lutyens, who had first examined and pronounced himself satisfied with the state of Barclay's wound, had waited until Emily stopped to speak to the young topman, Martin Dent, before quietly imparting this information to her husband, out of earshot. "The men who run this infirmary, Captain Barclay, 2 naval surgeons of long standing, and gentlemen with strong opinions." "And you believe them?" The surprise was very evident on Lutyens' face, one that appeared fish-like when his eyes were wide and his sharp nose raised in inquiry. "Why should I not?" "I fear exaggeration, sir. If this sentiment to free themselves from the Parisian yoke is so strong, why have they not acted?"
Lutyens waved his hand through an open window at the crowded anchorage. "I think the presence of several thousand sailors might have some bearing on the subject, though I am told that even their opinion is divided."
"It only has merit if such a thing is prevalent amongst the officers, Mr. Lutyens. Even in a revolutionary navy, officers command the ships."
"If, as you say, sir, you are dining with Admiral de Trogoff tonight, it might be an avenue of conversation worth pursuing. I am sure, like you, have no notion to remain a prisoner of the French, which we would not be if Toulon declares its detachment." That made Ralph Barclay stop in his tracks, for he had not followed through to the natural conclusion of what Lutyens had been saying. If the locals did cast off the revolutionary shackles, they would cease to be the enemy. They might give him back his ship repaired, and what remained of his crew, a prospect so enticing he could hardly bring himself to believe it possible, or speak of it. An immediate problem presented itself. Recalling the preening fellow who had come aboard brilliant, he had the sure knowledge that Admiral de Trogoff did not speak a word of English, and a conversation about what was being mooted was hardly one he could have through a third party. But Emily would be with him. Would she agree to be his interpreter? The trouble was that his wife had a very proper notion of what constituted good manners, something of which she had reminded him on more than one previous occasion. This might well fall outside that.
"I think perhaps, Mr. Lutyens, it might be worthwhile if you put the same proposition to my wife, who, after all, speaks the language, while I continue my tour."
"I hardly feel it is my place." Barclay interrupted him.
"Mr. Lutyens, I doubt you have any more desire to remain in captivity than I. All I am asking you to do is touch on a subject that would be a delicate one for me to advance."
Barclay strode off to the next cot, while Lutyens moved back to where Emily was still talking with Dent, who had said something to make her laugh, which was engaging. For a moment he held back, watching her standing in a shaft of strong light, her head slightly back, the bonnet she had put on to avoid the sun tilted back to reveal a happy face, and it occurred to him that he had rarely seen her so amused in the months they had been at sea, just as it pleased him to see it now. She really was a charming creature, so charming that in another place and in other circumstances— That was a train of thought better left.
"I see Martin has been jesting with you, Mrs. Barclay."
"He has indeed, Mr. Lutyens, for he has been telling me how he intends to escape disguised as a girl, and the image of that tickles me somewhat."
"He can try when he mends. I doubt a lass with her arm in a sling and a spotty face would pass muster." "Muster, Mr. Lutyens," crowed Martin with a wide grin. "Is you getting all nautical on us? Overexposure, disrespectful pup, to the likes of you.
Now, if I may borrow Mrs. Barclay, I have something to ask her."
"Thank you for visiting, ma'am. It's kindly."
"I shall visit again, Martin, and we can discuss dresses and the art of applying powder and rouge."
"Might we walk in the gardens for a moment, Mrs. Barclay?"
"The rest of your patients?"
"We'll wait a few moments, I'm sure."
There was a bench made of logs on a sort of terrace under a large elm tree where recovering invalids could take the air, and it was a curious Emily Barclay who allowed herself to be directed to it and invited to sit. The heat of the sun would have been oppressive anywhere else, but there was a gentle breeze coming in off the azure Mediterranean that made the situation pleasant, which Lutyens alluded to. Seated himself, and having made that observation, he seemed content to gaze out to sea, staying silent. "Do you regret taking this commission, Mr. Lutyens?" Emily asked, removing her bonnet.
"A strange question, is it not?"
"Hardly, sir. Are we not captives of our nation's enemies?"
Lutyens smiled. "I had no notion of being a prisoner, Mrs. Barclay."
"I think we know each other well enough now to be on Christian name terms." A furrow on that beautiful brow followed as she added a telling point. "At least, when my husband is not present. He is, as you know, a man who holds to certain standards."
"I am honoured that you think so, Emily. I think you know that my given name is Heinrich. Just as I know that your father is the pastor of the Lutheran Church in London, a place of worship frequented by the royal family. How do you know this? Lisbon was a place of much gossip, Heinrich. His church is hardly frequented by royals, Lutyens replied with a defensive air. The Queen attends occasionally, the King rarely, and their children only when commanded to do so. You have no idea how your presence aboard has excited speculation since your parentage became known. He had a very good idea, but he declined to say so. That someone so well connected should serve at sea at all, never mind in such a lowly vessel as a frigate. I was wondering, now that we are where we are, with no ship, might you tell me why? Lutyens had no intention of telling her, even if she was the one person aboard he would have opened up to, if that was part of his purpose. But what he was about he was determined to keep to himself. He had deliberately sought out a ship like HMS Brilliant for its size, as being a location where the crew was of a number that he could get to know and examine, not their physical beings, but the nature of their minds and the processes of their thoughts, something that would have been impossible on a fully manned ship of the line. He still had his notebooks and the journal into which he had transcribed his conclusions. And how could he tell her or anyone that being taken by the French, being able to observe the effects of captivity, added more meat to his aim, to write a treatise on the life and minds of sailors, both officers and men, how they put up with a life commonly known to be harsh, what made them so eager to fight? Did their nature differ at sea and on land? The frigate had turned out to be even more than he had hoped, with pressed men aboard who had insisted they were taken up illegally, volunteers who cared little for which ship they served on, and others, the late Hale and the still-alive Devereux, for instance, who seemed strangely attached to Ralph Barclay. Strange because he was not, to the surgeon's mind, a man who inspired affection. Emily Barclay had been an added bonus, as he watched a meek and uncertain young girl, well-bred, with a natural kindness, find her feet in a relationship with a man twice her age, in a milieu so different from that to which she was accustomed. And that had made doubly interesting observation of that singular creature, a naval captain, who had the power of life and death over his crew. Close observation had shown him currents of thought and action that began to make sense of that strange breed, the men of the sea, which he would write up as a paper. One, he knew, presented in the right quarters, would elevate him above the status of mere surgeon. Is it not common, Emily, for men to crave adventure? Would it offend you if I said that I do not see you in that light? I would say, my dear lady, that you would struggle to offend me, and since I have patients to see to, and your husband to satisfy as to their care, I must ask you the question that is the reason I brought you out here to this charming prospect. His explanation was simple and honest, which had Emily furrowing her brow again. I cannot see that I would have the right to withhold consent, Heinrich, for would I not be acting on behalf of every man who served under my husband, as well as he? You would, of course, for if what is being talked about comes to pass, they could all be free. Chapter 12. HMS Leander had joined the fleet by the time Midshipman Fairmelow came aboard the flagship, his news occasioning an immediate conference of the senior officers, both Spanish and British, with the youngster invited to stay for questioning, surprised at the sheer quantity of admirals. Hood's first captain, in essence the executive officer of the fleet, was Rear Admiral Sir Hyde Parker. Vice Admiral Hotham had, in the same capacity, another Rear Admiral of the Blue Squadron called Cosby, with the actual Rear Admiral of the fleet, Samuel Cranston Goodall, accommodating on his ship Rear Admiral Gell. And that was without the Spaniards, who, in terms of flag officers, outnumbered their allies 2-1. To Fairmelow's unformed mind, as he listened to the introductions, it all seemed a tad unwieldy. There was a civilian taking notes, but it was a telling indication of where he stood in the hierarchy that the actual captain of HMS Victory was not invited to attend. His job was to sail the ship.
So, gentlemen, according to Captain Gould's dispatch, our enemy has immediately available to him some 17 ships of the line, with some 13 in various states of refitting or repair.
Samuel Hood waited until that was translated for his Spanish counterparts, his heavy eyebrows lowered over a nose that dominated his ruddy, cratered complexion.
Thus, it seems obvious that delay is not in our interest. The French fleet will only grow stronger. My view is that we should let them sail in order that we take on and destroy them.
Admiral Hotham spoke then, toying with an apple in his hand.
I do not think we should be precipitate. It would not do to charge on with such flimsy evidence.
Hood's eyebrows closed even more, and a crooked finger summoned Fairmeadow forward.
You made several casts across the bay, boy, is that correct? And reported accurately to Captain Gould, so this list of ships is comprehensive?
Fairmeadow replied more like a croaking frog than a human being, so nervous was he, with Hood admonishing him to
take your time, young fellow.
He acknowledged what he and Glaister had done, sailing close in a fishing boat, which had seemed risky at the time, but now, related to these elevated personages, seemed tame. He added the names of ships they had been able to make out, but faltered when asked by the Spanish translator how they looked. It was Hyde Parker, a substantial, rosy-cheeked man who looked very comfortable in his slightly corpulent state, who clarified matters.
I think our friend is asking if they looked capable of giving battle.
That I could not give you an opinion on, sir. I lack the experience.
Properly said, lad,
Hood interjected, his look aimed at his second-in-command.
Properly said. We would not want anyone giving views which were based on faulty assumptions.
A little blood suffused Hotham's cheeks, and he put the apple to his mouth to cover for what had clearly been a rebuke. But he declined to take a bite, putting it untouched back on the table. As he did so, another civilian entered, a black-coated fellow with hands deeply stained with ink. He went to Hood and spoke quietly, words that Hood repeated to the room.
We have just had a signal from one of our frigates to say that a polaker is approaching under full sail from the north. The message is unclear, but it seems to be flying a flag of truce.
That set off a buzz of conversation in 2 languages, with Fairmeadow wondering and fearing that it might mean peace. If it did, there was little future for him in the Navy. Advancement only came with war.
I suggest, gentlemen, that we go on deck and see what we can make of this fellow.
One by one they trooped out, taking their hats from one of Hood's servants, until the Admiral's day cabin was empty, except for Midshipman Fairmeadow, agog as he had been on entering, at the space a flag officer was allowed on a ship, even one the size of Victory. A day cabin, a dining room, sleeping quarters, his own privy. It was luxury indeed to a boy accustomed to crowded mids quarters. Slowly he approached and ran his fingers over the highly polished oak of the round, paper-strewn table. Then he moved to stand behind the point from which Hood had presided over the meeting. There was devilment in his next act, to sit in the C&C's chair and to see that within arm's reach Hotham's apple was still on the table. Like most midshipmen, always hungry, the temptation was too much, and he grabbed it, taking a bite out that filled his mouth with fruit and had juice running down his chin. He then felt a shock go through his body when the voice said,
If and I were one of them there admirals, you would be on your way to the masthead by now.
Jumping up, Hood's chair went over as Fairmeadow exchanged looks with a check-shirted servant of an uncertain age, who was at least grinning.
Best get on deck, lad. Though I'd get shot of that there apple before Hotspur Hotham sees you. He's partial to his grub, that one. More partial than he is to activity. Mind, it will do more good in your gut than his.
Fairmeadow was out of the cabin in a flash, slipping past the marine sentries. He stopped on the companionway to finish the apple, stuffing the core in his pocket. Then he went on deck to see a raft of admirals, the captain, and at least 4 lieutenants, all looking north through extended telescopes.
"Captain Knight," said Hood, "ask your lookout to identify that flag at the masthead, would you?"
The captain of HMS Victory did not shout himself. The order was quietly passed to a lieutenant, and it was he who called aloft. The reply that came back set off another buzz of dual-tongued speculation.
"Looks like fleur-de-lis, Your Honour, the old standard of the Marine Royale."
Which it proved to be when it came close enough to be seen from the deck, a blue flag dotted with the French royal device in gold, very obvious against the dark red sails of the Polaker.
Hood spoke again. "Captain Knight, a gun if you please, just in case he has not made out my flag."
That flew at the foremast, the pennant of a vice-admiral of the Red Squadron. The gun had an effect, the French ship altering course slightly to close the flagship, and now, on the afterdeck, they could see several civilians in tightly buttoned coats with scarves tied round their heads to keep on their hats.
"Marines and your Premier at the entry port, Captain Knight, please."
Then he laughed, which was a deep rumble.
"To either give these people a salute or shoot them."
Hood led the way back down to his cabin on the main deck, with one young and nervous midshipman who followed because he had no idea if they were finished with him, wondering if a certain admiral would miss his apple and demand to know where it had gone. Suddenly that core in his pocket felt visible, and Fairmolo cursed himself for not getting rid of it when he had the chance.
"Marseille is entirely in our hands, monsieur. The Jacobins have been sent packing, their infernal guillotine has been broken up, and those who support the madness in Paris have left the city on their coat-tails."
"And the reaction, Monsieur Rebequi?"
asked Hood. The Frenchman, who claimed to be a deputy to the National Assembly in the Girondist interest, spoke with enthusiastic certainty, his face showing the excitement he obviously felt. This while those who had accompanied him and spoke no English looked on anxiously, for he had not translated his words for their benefit, and shifted uncomfortably under the keen gaze of this clutch of Spanish and British officers. He had managed to tell the Assembly that he personally was uncomfortable under a Bourbon flag. He was a Republican through and through, without in any way saying if he had voted for the death of King Louis.
"So far, Admiral, none, and I do not anticipate there will be any. The forces the Jacobins can put against us are in disarray, an ill-disciplined rabble. More important, we have had representatives come from Toulon to say that the sentiment there is of the same nature as in Marseille, though action is harder, for there are elements of the fleet who are against revolt. Lyon is in open revolt, and the right-minded are stirring in Nîmes and Montauban."
"And what, monsieur, would you have us do?"
"Land men and materiel, Admiral, and take possession of what is the major city in Provence, and is too a substantial port. We have gathered an army of 10,000 men with the aim of marching to the aid of the Lyonnais, and we will grow stronger on the way. It's different with what you could provide."
"There is nothing between you and them?"
asked Hotham, as Rebequi left the rest of his sentence up in the air.
"A rabble, unfit for combat."
"I do not have what you seek, monsieur."
Fairmolo, standing well back against a bulkhead, saw the speaker's face fall, and that was replicated in the worried looks of his companions, who read his reaction. Rebequi had about him the air of an orator, with drama in his voice and gestures, so it was easy to see the change from enthusiasm to doubt as Hood continued,
"I have, at best, if I strip every ship in my fleet, some 1,500 marines, and I assume Admiral Langara to have something of the same number."
A look at the Spanish translator brought forth a nod.
3,000 men are not enough to hold a city like Marseille, regardless of how much your enemies are in disorder, and I cannot march them away from their ships and into open country. It is too dangerous."
"Sailors?"
"Please be so good as to translate for your companions," Hood insisted. "They are growing increasingly concerned."
The Frenchman complied, which did nothing for the mood. If anything, it deepened their gloom.
"There is also the fact that, from information we have just received, the Toulon fleet is preparing to weigh. Let us say that I agreed to partially aid you by taking charge of the port. To secure Marseille would require me to take my ships into a situation in which they would not be able to maneuver. In fact, one in which they could be blockaded, cut off from the sea by your country's warships, and the land from the forces of the men you call Jacobins. I could not even contemplate putting such a notion to this conference.
Then what are we to do, Admiral?
You must put aside any thought of going to Lyons. Instead, hold as best you can with what you have and let your enemies assault you, not the other way round. If they are, as you say, a rabble, then they will break against your defences with a greater loss than you will suffer.
Hood looked at his fellow admirals as he continued, as if to seek their silent support.
I, with my Spanish allies, must sail on to Toulon. If the fleet is at sea, we must meet and defeat it. If not, we must keep it bottled up in the harbour. Once that is achieved, we can look at other possibilities.
Rebecca protested. It is an opportunity not to be missed, Admiral. The whole of France could be yours.
I, monsieur, must first hold the whole of the Mediterranean, for I am, as you can see, a sailor.
Hood then turned to face the civilians, even if they could not understand him.
Believe me, messieurs, if I could help you, I would. But though it may not sound this way, our interests coincide with yours. The city of Marseille, indeed the whole of southern France, can only be held if the Toulon fleet is reduced to impotence. Monsieur Rebecca, please be so good as to translate that.
A loud cough came from a doorway, and Fairmelot craned to see that same fellow who had caught him eating the apple.
Hood nodded to him and said,
Gentlemen, a turn on deck, if you please, so that my servants can set things for dinner.
In a louder voice he added,
Which will naturally include our newly arrived guests from Marseille.
Hood was left alone, looking at something on the table, as Fairmelot began to edge out in the wake of the others. The voice stopped him dead.
Mr. Fairmelot?
Sir?
What the devil are you doing here?
It was as if all his blood had suddenly decided to fill his boots.
I was unsure if I was still required, sir.
You heard what I said to the Frenchman?
Fairmelot nodded, and Hood crooked a finger, adding,
But did you understand it?
I think so,
Fairmelot squeaked, moving towards the table, and what he now saw was a large map showing the coast of France from the Spanish border to Italy. Hood's next words were larded with irony.
Then you are wiser than your years, boy, for there were flag officers in this cabin a moment ago that did not.
His finger hit the chart.
Look here.
Fairmelot followed his finger, as Hood outlined the wide delta of the rivers Rhône and Durance, with the city of Marseille further down the bay. This while a raft of servants were arriving with the leaves and supports of a large dining table.
Flat country to one side, some protection from marshes, but multiple lines of assault down the river valleys. The place is surrounded by hills, but they have long crests, and are some distance from the actual port. I have no faith in this 10,000 men of theirs. If the armies opposing them are a rabble, they cannot be much better. They may well be forced to retreat and do as I suggested. Yet the defence of such a city and port would require a much larger and better trained army, which, as I pointed out to our Frenchmen, I do not have. I could secure the place from the sea, but to what purpose? The task of a British fleet is to fight and win at sea. Are you hungry?
The question threw Fairmelot, as he was concentrating on a map and a problem he barely understood, terrified he would be asked a question, but not that one.
Yes, sir.
Hood replied with a good-humoured growl.
Never knew a mid that wasn't. Tell my steward to set a place for you. Might tickle your ambition to see the comforts an admiral enjoys.
Another midshipman came through the open doorway between two bits of table.
Captain Knight's compliments, sir, but HMS Tartar has made her number and is flying a signal to say she's carrying dispatches.
Signal Tartar to close. Captain to come aboard. Mr. Fairmelot, you might wish to introduce yourself to the mid's berth. But keep your ear out for the dinner drum."
John Pearce had never seen a fleet at sea, and he had to admit that he was mightily impressed by the sight as HMS Tartar ran between the two columns. The towering masts and huge dun-coloured sails, as well as the strict order in which they held station, actually induced in him the strangest emotion, one he recognised as a swelling of pride. In a more rational moment he would have scoffed at such a feeling, but he was, for all his scepticism, a Briton, and to see these huge leviathans actually at sea, and to have some feeling for the power they projected, was stirring.
"Lieutenant Pearce," called Captain Fremantle, "we have been called aboard Victory. Please be prepared to accompany me."
"Sir."
"And I will get one of the wardroom servants to secure your sea chest. You may not be staying with us much longer."
Orders rang out to get Captain Fremantle's boat alongside as his coxswain hurried the oarsmen to their stations. Pearce went below to collect his dispatches and to pack his own chest, taking too long about it, so that a mid was sent to tell him in a voice in which Fremantle's irony was copied that the captain was awaiting his pleasure. Fremantle was pacing back and forth before the open gangway, his clerk beside him carrying his muster-book and logs in a sack slung over his shoulder. And his greeting was in the same vein, one which had all the other officers on deck, those who had brawled with him in Gibraltar, grinning. It was the same grin that they had displayed when, out at sea, Captain Fremantle had called Pearce to his cabin and quietly roasted him for getting his officers involved in a brawl.
"Good of you to join us, Mr. Pearce,"
as the clerk went over the side.
"Now please lead the way into the boat."
That made John Pearce gulp, for he knew he was no master of the art of getting into an open boat in a running sea off a moving vessel, knew that he could very easily make a complete ass of himself. But there was no alternative. He was junior. He must go first. Looking over the side, he saw that the man-ropes were well secured by the stanchions fitted to the timbers, that the cutter was bobbing around on what was not even remotely a rough sea, being held steady from the ship's side by men who stood and swayed easily as the waves ran under the boat. He called to the coxswain, "You there! Catch, if you please!" And with that he threw his oilskin pouch into the man's hands, for he had no notion of trying to descend with that to encumber him.
"Please feel free to take your time, Mr. Pearce. Admiral Lord Hood is, as I'm sure you know, all patience."
The laughter was suppressed, but it was there. Captain Fremantle was not a shouter, but his biting sarcasm, his chief weapon of command, was more wounding. Pearce turned to face him, and taking hold of the man-ropes, put a foot out to locate one of the battens that ran down the frigate's side, his foot waving about uncertainly until it finally made contact. He had seen people do this, men used to the act, who leaned back to a point where their bodies appeared near horizontal, men who did not need to look down every second to see where their next foot was to go. Slowly his head disappeared, but not until he heard Fremantle quip,
"Damn me, Mr. Pearce, I hope you board an enemy quicker than you exit a friend."
It was not far to the cutter, 10 feet when it crested a wave, 15 in a trough, though it seemed a mile, and it was made doubly uncertain by the fact that the battens were wet, caked in salt, and slippery. Pearce knew he was too upright, but he lacked the confidence to ease backwards and let his arms hold him, so that it took him an age to actually get aboard. Sat in the thwarts, he saw Thomas Fremantle skip down with ease till he took his place beside him.
"I think, coxswain, now that our guest is comfortable, we may cast off."
It was only when he was halfway across the gap between the huge bulk of HMS Victory and the insignificant-looking Tartar that he finally looked at Captain Fremantle. He saw that his jaw was set tight, and the slightly humorous look he normally wore was absent. He had heard enough in his week on the frigate to know that Lord Hood was a proper Tartar himself. Indeed, he had been obliged to listen to endless puns of the ship's name and admiral's reputation. Odd, then, that he was quite relaxed, while the captain was clearly nervous. In the great cabin, the same Lord Hood was being subjected to a moan from the only man, it was said, who dared to address him so, the same fellow who had let Fairmallow eat Hotham's apple.
Is I to fetch another leaf from the hold, or what?"
"Do be silent, Sims," growled Hood.
The Admiral's steward ignored that, his voice becoming even more crabbed.
"I set the cook a dinner for 12, and no sooner have I done that than you had another half-dozen. Now, not content with landing me with a mid and a captain suddenly come up on the horizon, as though they sniffed the grub, I'm told there is 2 officers in the bugger's boat, not 1. That there table will need resetting for the 3rd time. Now, if and there be anyone else to come and let me know, and I'll extend it." "One of these days, Sims, I am going to extend your neck, which will have the added virtue of stilling your damned tongue."
The steward exited, tetchy still, his voice fading.
"Should have stayed ashore, a man your age. Had everything, comfort of your own hearth and high office, and you going and chuck it all up for a cruise."
Up above his head he could hear his dinner guests moving around, being entertained as they were in Captain Knight's cabin, sipping their pre-prandial drinks. He should have gone there with them and left that grouchy bugger Sims to get on with his tasks. Then he smiled. The man had been with him for 3 decades. They knew each other inside out. Many's a time his steward had pointed out to him where he was doing wrong, something no one else, certainly not his inferior officers, seemed brave enough to contemplate. Command was a lonely station, for all the privileges. An honest voice was worth a mint, even if it did come from an untutored pest. Marine boots crashed outside the doorway, and his clerk appeared to announce, "Captain Fremantle, sir, and Lieutenant Pearce."
"Captain,"
Hood said, peering at Pearce, who was holding his oilskin pouch over his belly.
"The lieutenant has the dispatches from Gibraltar, sir, which he has given your clerk, as well as a set which has come from Downing Street."
"Indeed."
"To be given into your hands only, sir," Pearce added. "Mr. Pitt was most insistent."
"Then do that thing, Lieutenant,"
Hood replied as they were passed over. The drum rolled out on the quarterdeck to announce dinner, and those feet above his head began to move.
"I will read these later. You will, of course, join us for dinner?"
"Much obliged, sir," said Fremantle with palpable gratitude. Pearce said nothing. He was not so sure, looking at the table and the number of place settings, that an invitation was to be welcomed. Fairmellow, shaved again, got clean linen only because the dirty shirt he had to swap was so much better than that for which he exchanged it, a well-washed and worn affair that had nothing left of cloth under the armpits. The villain who had dunned him, a fellow midshipman of the same size, had at least let him black his shoes, polish his buttons, and brush the salt streaks out of his coat. The breeches would just have to do, and anyway they would be under the table. He was surprised to bump into another mid from Brilliant called Toby Burns, and that was when the drum roll caught him, so he had to run up to the main deck and the Admiral's cabin. By the time he got there, half the guests were seated, and that got him a dark look from Hood, who indicated that he should take his place at the far end of the table next to the Marine captain. That he did, looking down the snow-white cloth, covered in crystal and silverware, to the other end, where sat the Marseille civilians, the leader of whom, the fellow called Rebecca, had been given a place of honour just past the Admiral's on the host's right hand. There was a lieutenant talking to those citizens, obviously put there because he knew the language, and sideways on there was something familiar about his bearing. But it was not until he looked up the long table and their eyes met that Fairmellow felt real shock. Burns had been enough of a surprise, but now he was seeing, in a lieutenant's uniform, dining at an admiral's table, a man who only a few months before he had seen lashed to a grating. Chapter 13. Since the hour off Marseille was the same in Toulon, the Barclays found themselves sitting down for dinner at the same time as those aboard HMS Victory, one either side of Contre-Admiral le Comte de Trogoff, albeit ashore and in a well-appointed dining-room at the quayside chateau that he used as his headquarters. The windows were shuttered to keep out the heat of the late afternoon sun, but there was still sufficient light to sparkle off the plate and crystal glasses, as well as illuminate the dark portraits of previous incumbents studded around the walls. De Trogoff's junior admiral, Saint-Julien, was also present, as well as numerous captains and marine officers. The difference from the meal happening at sea was the presence of ladies, not least Emily Barclay, dressed in her most becoming jade gown, her auburn hair piled high and held by a matching silk band. In the company of gallant French officers she had attracted a great deal of admiration, in all of which she took pleasure, much to the chagrin of her husband and those naval wives and mistresses who felt neglected. Ralph Barclay was doubly cross that he could see the attentiveness but could only guess at what was being said in the way of compliments. Admiral de Trogoff, in his powdered wig and flabby, florid countenance, was too mature and rotund to make for much of a suitor. Not that such impediments debarred him from the attempt, for he kissed Emily's hand with a lavish, almost slavering courtesy. His second-in-command was a different kettle of fish altogether, and Ralph Barclay examined him closely. Rear Admiral Etienne Saint-Julien was a darkly handsome cove with shiny, carefully curled hair worn in the latest revolutionary fashion, and he was quite unabashed in using his seniority to discourage any other officer who wished to pay court to Emily Barclay in the time before they actually sat down at table, seemingly equally adept at ignoring the furious looks he was getting from the lady who had accompanied him. Decency and language had obliged the host to place Captain Dambert on Ralph Barclay's left, which was just as well, given that de Trogoff had little inclination to speak with him, more concerned to stop Saint-Julien monopolizing Emily to his right. Saint-Julien's paramour on the far side of her escort had no choice but to talk to her other neighbour, since her man was likewise engaged.
"Your countrymen seem to have a deep interest in the opinions of my wife, monsieur."
If Dambert picked up the pique in Ralph Barclay's tone, he did not respond to it, smiling as though such a thing was natural, which to him, of course, was the case. It was a French gentleman's duty to pay court to beauty.
"I fear an English flag officer would feel an obligation to converse equally with both his guests, rather than just one."
"I would take it as a compliment were I in your position, Captain Barclay."
"Would you indeed?"
"It is mere gallantry, and of course rivalry, and I am obliged to add that the subject warrants the attention."
The smile disappeared from his disease-scarred face.
"How I wish it was ever the case, but I fear our pair of admirals would compete over a used dog-bone."
Earlier conversations had established that Le Baron d'Ambert was the senior captain in the fleet, a man who would have been an admiral himself by now if the Ministry of Marine in Paris was not overseen by Jacobins. Another officer of the old Marine Royale, he came from that strata of French society which had seen it as de rigueur to be competent in English, something he had perfected when serving as a young captain in the American Revolutionary War, so that his voice had in it the twang of the old colonies.
"They do not see eye to eye?"
Ralph Barclay asked. Dambert smiled.
"I believe that is what an Englishman would call an understatement. I doubt they could agree on the hour if called upon to do so."
Ralph Barclay had a glass of wine halfway to his mouth, but it stopped there, for this hinted at proof of what Lutyens had said at the infirmary.
"Would you feel it impertinent of me to inquire as to some of those differences?"
"Not at all, Captain," Dambert replied with a bitter tone. "Why be discreet about that which is common gossip in the markets and on the fish quay? Our friend Saint-Julien yonder is a staunch Republican, a committed supporter of the Revolution, a Jacobin, and a creature of Paris, eager to get the fleet to sea and meet an enemy he suspects is on its way from England. Admiral de Trogoff, on the other hand, sees the fleet as a weapon to be preserved, that to lose it would be a disaster, and in contrast to Saint-Julien, he has a conscience about his oath to his late sovereign, as well as a deep distrust of those now running the country."
"Is he a royalist, then?"
That might be too deep an emotion for a man not given to such definition. Let us just say that he is uncomfortable serving those who presently hold power."
"So he does not hanker after a restoration?"
"If I understand the word hanker correctly, which I admit I may not, then it describes his attitude very well. It does not, after all, suggest any sense of real engagement. But in his defence, it needs to be pointed out the consequences of open disagreement with Paris would mean a great deal more than merely being superseded. He could lose his head. I must ask you, Captain Dambert, what your own feelings are. Let us say that I, like most of my fellow officers, prefer order to chaos.
Captain Berkeley, Emily called across to Trogoff, producing an unwelcome distraction, to which her husband nevertheless had to respond. Admiral Saint-Julien has invited me to take a carriage ride with him into the hills outside the town. He says there are fields of lavender that stretch for miles, which I may pick to my heart's content.
Her husband looked past his wife at the coiffed Saint-Julien, wet-lipped and smiling, his hooded eyes quite unabashed in the way he held the Englishman's gaze. Ralph Barclay smiled at Saint-Julien and touched the white bandage on his head before replying, in a gesture designed to ensure this popinjay knew he was a fighter.
Tell the Admiral, my dear, that we would be delighted.
The emphasis was enough to make Emily blush slightly, and she sounded hurt.
I do hope you did not think I would go with him alone.
Not for a moment, Mrs. Barclay, but I suspect that the Admiral would not object if you did. Then he turned to Dambert and said, not without irritation,
Gallantry, you say?
I fear the revolution has destroyed more than the ancient monarchy of France. Manners have suffered as well.
Ralph Barclay was not a patient man, never had been, and that knowing look from Saint-Julien made his next question a sharp one.
What support does the junior admiral have?
Captain Dambert hesitated then, for it was obvious that to reply to such a direct inquiry was to commit an indiscretion much greater than anything he had said hitherto. The truth of that was in the keen look on Ralph Barclay's face, and the Frenchman toyed with his glass of wine while he ruminated on the consequences, with his fellow guest holding his breath for what seemed an age.
It would be impossible to be precise. It depends on how many of the sailors would follow their officers.
The officers, then, would back Admiral de Trogoff.
Let us just say that their opinions are likely to coincide.
The warrants?
The look of incomprehension Dambert gave him then made him add,
The ship's standing officers, the masters, gunners, boatswains, and the like.
You know as well as I do that on any warship they are the men, the steady types, that the crew will listen to. If a drastic course of action is proposed, you cannot carry the crews without you carry such people. I would only say this, Captain Barclay. Those who are true seamen and have served for a time will not follow Saint-Julien. But you must understand the fleet has been expanded, and those brought in by the needs of war are not of the same calibre.
Captain Barclay, said Admiral de Trogoff, pardonnez-moi.
The beneficiary of what came next had to wait until Dambert translated words that were full of apology for ignoring his guest of honour. John Pearce sat in idle contemplation as Lord Hood read the private dispatches, that followed by the letter from Pitt, recalling the look he had exchanged with the young fair-haired midshipman, wondering if he had shown any shock to match that which he had observed. He hoped not, for in his imagination he had many times conjured up a vision of meeting those who would recall him as a pressed landsman. That Fairmelo would do that he did not doubt. The boy had been with Barclay the night he had been forcibly taken up, so his name was imprinted on Pearce's mind, and it was not one to conjure up kind thoughts.
Are you privy to what is in these papers, Lieutenant?
No, sir, except that Mr. Pitt told me some of what he intended to write regarding my needs based upon submissions I made to him.
About your being pressed?
That and other things.
He makes much of the mode of your elevation to your present rank, and the reason.
If he included that, I was not aware of it.
I would have objected in the strongest terms had I been available to be consulted. The granting of commissions is the prerogative of those who run the Navy.
Mr. Pitt seemed anxious not to upset the king. Hood nearly snarled his reply to that.
It does sovereigns good to sometimes be disappointed.
There was a moment when he looked as though he was going to quote a few examples,
but the annoyance cleared from both his face and his voice.
"Let us concentrate on the matter of your alleged impressment for now. I would wish to hear what happened in your own words."
Rehearsed so many times they did not sound half as convincing spoken as they had in his head, and he left out the fact that he was running from a King's Bench warrant at the time, and had only ended up in the Pelican to avoid that pursuit. For mention of his father to a political admiral like Hood would not aid his cause. Instead, he emphasized the fact that pressing men for sea service was illegal in the liberties of the Savoy, in which the Pelican Tavern was located.
"I will not inquire as to why you were in such a place."
In saying that, Hood was making it plain what he knew, that the liberties were a part of London where those in fear of arrest for debt or minor crime took refuge, a few streets betwixt the River Thames and the Strand, part of the grounds of the old Savoy Palace, from which bailiffs and tipstaffs were banned. Pearce nodded towards the open letter on his desk. "I did not reside there. My presence on that night was pure bad luck. It was the same for one of my friends, but two of them did live there, as well as an old fellow now dead as a direct consequence of being taken up. Whatever reason they had to be in the liberties does not detract from the fact that they were illegally pressed."
"The truth of that is yet to be decided."
"Not in my mind." The response was too sharp, too fierce, and that showed in the glowering look with which it was greeted.
"I think you will find, young man, that speaking to me in that tone will not do anything to aid your submission."
Pearce made sure of a more emollient pitch when he replied. "Forgive me, sir, but I hope you will appreciate how the event still rankles. And if you wish for the truth of what I say, you have a midshipman aboard, a member of HMS Brilliant's crew who was there on that very night and took part in the operation."
"Fairmillow?"
Pearce nodded, and Hood called out for someone to fetch the youngster, after which he shuffled the letters, then said,
"While we are waiting, the action with the Valmy. I sailed before that happened. Tell me about it."
Pearce reckoned this to be no time for modesty, but he managed, without sounding vain, to tell of the action, of how he had found himself forced to make decisions, of those he had made, and the result. As Hood listened, Pearce had the impression he was not entirely concentrating on what he was hearing, that he was thinking of other matters, which was unusual in a naval officer hearing a tale of battle. "The result, you know, sir. I was whisked off to Windsor. The King was excitable and insisted on my promotion. Lord Chatham objected. His brother did not. I, for one, have no idea if it was deserved, only that it exists."
"I saw you in deep conversation with those Frenchmen from Marseille."
Slightly thrown by the change of subject, Pearce took a second to respond. "They were worried for their lives, sir. Monsieur Rebecki does not enjoy their full confidence, and they are not as one in their views. He, for instance, is a member of the faction called the Gironde."
"Please don't confuse me, Pearce. Gironde, Feuillants, Jacobins. To me, these Frenchmen and their damned factions are all as one."
"Like Whigs and Tories?"
"Nothing like, as well you know, young man."
Pearce could not resist baiting him, thinking his fellow countrymen, this admiral included, pious in their condemnation of the French. "It took them some time, I grant you, to get round to beheading a king, but you cannot deny that we in Britain, in chopping the head off the first King Charles, set them a precedent of near a century and a half." Hood would not be drawn into a discussion about the judicial murder of monarchs, British Stuarts or French Bourbons.
"I believe we were talking about your dinner companions."
"Most would call themselves Republicans, but with, I think, no great depth of conviction. Some even mentioned a declaration for the brother of the late King Louis as a way to ward off the revenge of Paris. As I say, they are worried." That only got a raised eyebrow.
"They have every right to be, Pearce, and it is of some regret that I can do nothing to aid them. Let us hope the Revolutionary Army is in as much disarray as they claim. You speak good French, obviously."
"I lived in Paris for over 2 years, and my father, naturally as a Scot, having a warm feeling towards an old ally, made sure I had a grounding in the language before that." The big eyebrows went up.
"Indeed. Might I inquire what took you there?"
It was with an air of defiance that Pearce answered, "My father took me there."
"Pearce," Hood said, his look uncertain, clearly seeking to make a connection in his mind. "Paris?" That he did so was obvious by the sharp nod that followed. What was strange was the fact that he did not say anything more.
"Mr. Fairbelow, sir," said his secretary.
"Show the boy in."
Expecting more questions about Toulon, Fairmelow's heart sank when he saw Pearce sitting at the Admiral's table, and the look the man gave him did nothing to ease his disquiet. If he had been a discomforting presence aboard HMS Brilliant, he was a damn sight more so now. In the intervening hour he had had plenty of time to recall everything he knew about the fellow and the trouble he had caused, though they had had little direct contact.
"Mr. Fairbelow," said Hood, "this gentleman claims that he was illegally pressed into the Navy. He also says that you were present at the time. I wonder if you would care to shed any light on that."
A boy would have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to be unaware that what Barclay had done was not officially permitted. It had been a topic of discussion in the wardroom, and that had filtered down to the gunroom, with much ribbing aimed at him about being hung, drawn, and quartered for being part of it. Well aware that the blame for transgressions had a way of spreading, the other topic of conversation had been the response to an accusation. So it was without hesitation that Fairbelow replied, "I was with Captain Barclay, sir, and obeying his orders."
"So you do not deny that Mr. Pearce here was pressed?"
"No, sir." Fairbelow paused then, trying to remember after all these months what it was Barclay had actually said on that night. He could recall the captain being in a foul temper, but then that was not unusual. "We were short on our complement and had orders to weigh. Captain Barclay made it plain that we needed hands, and that failure to get any would seriously compromise the ability of our ship to function. With the extra hands, we were able to depart Sheerness the next morning."
"You are not aware that I saw Captain Barclay the very day this impressment is alleged to have taken place?"
It was with genuine shock that Fairbelow responded, "No, sir." Pearce merely looked inquisitive at the use of the word alleged.
"The location of this was?"
Hood inquired. "The Thames, sir, above Blackfriars Bridge, where we were expected to find at least some of those we took up were bred to the sea."
"But not all?"
"There was no time to inquire, sir. Captain Barclay insisted we act quickly and take whosoever we could lay hands on, albeit they were to be of the right age and fit enough to serve." "Tell me, Mr. Fairbelow," said Pearce, earning himself a dark look from Hood, who clearly felt he had no business interfering. "Do you know anything about the liberties of the Savoy?" "No," Fairbelow replied, unable to add a "sir" to that. "They are in the part of London from which I was pressed." "I don't know London. That night was the only time I've been there."
"So you had no idea," demanded Hood, taking back the interrogation, "that the place from which you were taking these men had a protection under the auspices of the Duchy of Lancaster?"
"No, sir, I did not." Again Pearce cut in. "But you found out subsequently, I suspect?" Hood barked at him this time, his heavy eyebrows nearly joined above his nose.
"Mr. Pearce, please be so good as to leave this questioning to me. It makes no odds what people knew subsequently. All that matters is what they knew at the time."
Fairbelow was looking at the deck beams above his head, and Pearce, examining the boy, suddenly felt a tinge of sympathy for him. He was a midshipman. If his captain told him to do something, there was no way a lad like this would question his orders. The real culprit was not present, and it was cruel to make Fairbelow suffer for the sins of Ralph Barclay. "Mr. Fairbelow, I apologize to you, but please understand that the memory of that night to me is something that I cannot recall without anger. It is then hardly surprising that it can be misdirected." "Thank you," Fairbelow said, genuinely relieved, for he was certain he was going to carry the kid for that night, certain that he would be sent home in disgrace.
"Thank you, Mr. Fairbelow,"
said Hood, going back to the letters on his desk.
"That will be all."
There was silence for a while as he reread some of Pitt's letter, his brow furrowing in a way that implied some of what he was reading was unpleasant.
"So, Mr. Pearce, you are in need of a place."
I am in need of a solution to the problem we have just been discussing, sir. If I and my companions already named were illegally pressed, and are anxious to get release from service at sea, then you are in a position to grant that wish."
"I can do nothing until I have questioned Captain Barclay."
"Who is where?"
"Off Toulon."
"Which is where the fleet is headed, is it not?" Hood sat back in his chair, and when he spoke his voice was flat, though the words he used were as pointed as they could be.
"It seems to me, young man, that you have a very unfortunate manner. I think my rank entitles me to a little more in the way of polite address."
"That would only be because you are used to the company of naval officers." That was nothing short of damned cheek, but Hood did not respond. His voice remained even.
"Which you have been commissioned as. Whether such a thing is right or wrong, it is nevertheless true."
"One of the advantages of not seeking advancement, Lord Hood, is the fact that I can talk as I wish." Hood sat forward then and lifted Pitt's letter.
"It says here that Mr. Pitt would be most obliged if I would consider you for a place. You may or may not know that I am part of his government, appointed to my naval office by the very same man who tells me he has a commitment to you. He makes it plain how much meeting that means to him, which makes his request a hard one to deny."
Pearce nearly blurted out the truth, that such a thing had only been added as a desperate attempt to make sure he got to where he was now, that if Hood acted as he should, then such a request had no relevance. What stopped him he did not know, only that the Admiral's attitude perplexed him, and that it was better to keep to his chest what cards he had to play with rather than squander them.
"So," Hood continued, "I think in those circumstances a little less arrogance would be in your interest."
"Can I ask about your meeting with Captain Barclay prior to my being pressed?" Hood smiled.
"No, Lieutenant Pearce, you may not. Now please be so good as to depart, as I have more pressing business to attend to, dealing with our friends from Marseille."
Then he added,
"I apologize for the play on words. It was unintentional."
Chapter 14. Midshipman Toby Burns was sitting on the south-facing part of the mainmast cap, digesting his dinner. He liked it up here when the flagship was sailing on a steady wind, with no one needing to trim sails, and only the change of the lookouts plus the odd ship's boys skylarking to disturb his peace. Most of his contemporaries liked to stay below, snug in their berth. Since he had never liked it there, nor had much regard for the company, either on this ship or HMS Brilliant, he stayed out of the place as much as he could. The sun was shining, he was delightfully warm, with a welcome breeze this far aloft to ensure he was not baking in the late afternoon heat. Aboard as a supernumerary, being carried as a passenger until he rejoined his own ship, he had no duties except to daily attend the schoolmaster's lessons, something which the Premier of HMS Victory had insisted on as a cure for outright idleness. Earlier hints that he might undertake some duties, which would have relieved some of the ship's designated midshipmen, had been politely declined, an attitude which would have produced an ill reaction were it not that the fellow concerned was something of a hero. The unexpected arrival of Midshipman Fairmelow had no seeming effect on that status, although to see him aboard the flagship was a shock. But it had served one purpose, for although there had been caution, he and Fairmelow had not been close, there had been no outright reserve in the greeting, which confirmed how he was seen aboard the frigate. In short, he was still a hero in the places that mattered, the gunroom, wardroom, and captain's cabin. At one time he had worried that one or two of the common seamen might have a different opinion, but then he had reasoned that no one who mattered cared what they thought, or would listen to what they said. It was therefore a great shock to look down at the quarterdeck and realize that the fellow who had just emerged from the after companionway, and in raising his hat to the officer of the watch had revealed his face, was the one man who could blow that undeserved reputation out of the water and damn him as a useless coward. What the hell was Pearce doing in the uniform of a lieutenant, and clearly being greeted as such? Burns got himself behind the mainmast double quick, so that when John Pearce looked up all he saw was the flash of a disappearing blue coat and white ducks. Given permission to walk the forecastle, he made his way along the gangway that ran alongside the spar deck, to where he could contemplate in peace what had happened in the Admiral's cabin, not least the suspicion that, despite the plain fact that he had established the illegality of Barclay's actions, and the men he wanted released were part of the fleet, Hood had seemed disinclined to do anything about it. Above his head, Toby Burns slipped back to the front of the mainmast, well hidden by the thick oak, desperately trying to think what to do. It was not just his status as a hero that was at risk. The way he had left Pearce and his friends had been seen by them as a stroke of downright duplicity, even if he was obeying his captain's precise orders at the time. Pearce had made it plain that he would exact revenge for that, and in the imagination of Toby Burns that took many forms, none of them pleasant. Suddenly the sun was not so warm, and the boy shivered with fear. Seeing where his nemesis had gone, he made his way back to the deck by the shrouds. To use a backstay might attract attention, his mind concentrating on where he could hide. HMS Victory was a large and crowded vessel, yet he knew long before he got back to it that the safest place for him was in that part of the ship he liked least, the midshipman's berth.
"Fairmillo,"
he whispered urgently, for they were not alone.
"You'll never guess who I've just seen."
The other mid, stripped to the waist, did not look up as he ham-fistedly tried to repair a hole in the near-threadbare shirt he had exchanged prior to the Admiral's dinner. "Pearce."
"The very fellow. What the devil's he doing aboard?"
"More to the point, what is he doing outranking us, Burns?" The other midshipman, having pricked a finger for the third time, threw the shirt to one side and finally looked into the anxious face of Burns, wondering if any more spots had erupted since he had last seen him a couple of hours before. They had never really got on, although the acquaintance had not been of a long duration, weeks rather than months, for Burns had seemed a bit of a milksop aboard Brilliant, always moaning, dodging his duties, and rather unfitted for a life at sea, slow to learn anything, and even slower to apply what he had garnered. There was a certain amount of envy, too. The fact that Captain Barclay, whose wife was the milksop's aunt, had sent him away with a prize and a positive dispatch that would do his future career no harm. This had not endeared Burns to any of the other mids or master's mates aboard the frigate, in what was seen as a clear case of nepotism. "I fear he has come to see your uncle put in irons," Fairmillo added.
"My uncle?"
"Captain Barclay." Toby Burns was well aware of how his departure had been seen by his contemporaries, for he had been the youngest mid aboard. They had seen as corrupt what he had reckoned to be a reward for nearly losing his life, and if not that, at least a release from the misery of service. Going back to serve on HMS Brilliant was not something to which he was looking forward. Service life was not as he had imagined it to be before enlisting, and he had tried to wriggle out of doing so with various claims of illness while at home. But the reasons that had seen him leaving home the first time, when he still harboured romantic notions of a naval career, still applied. His parents, having seen to his elder brothers, did not have the means to underwrite a career that went with their station in life. The Navy took aboard and educated its future officers for free. Therefore Toby, the youngest in the family, must make his way in that profession.
"He's not really a proper uncle, Fairmillo. I've told you that a dozen times."
"I fail to see how he's not, when he's wedded to your Aunt Emily, who is cousin to your father, though only the good Lord knows how such a match came about." Toby Burns knew why. His grandparents' substantial house was entailed to the distant Barclay relatives through a previous connection. Emily marrying the captain had secured tenure for the whole family, not least his own mother and father, who, by living with those relatives, could keep up the appearance of some social standing with little or no income.
"What do you mean, putting Captain Barclay in irons?"
Fairmillo told him what had happened in Hood's cabin. But he did not open up, did not trust Burns enough to say that he had known very well that what they were about was illegal, and that had nothing to do with things they called liberties. The laws on impressment were strict. Only men bred to the sea were to be taken up. It made no odds that the law was observed more in the breach. Breaking it and being had up was serious, and he feared that he might be caught in the backwash of Barclay's actions. "Anyway, Burns, you were with him when you went ashore, so you must have a better idea than I of how he got his rank."
"I didn't go ashore with him or the others. They were pressed in soundings."
Fairmeadow looked at him then with marked curiosity as Burns went a deep red, which made the numerous spots on his face flare.
"I had orders from Captain Barclay that if such a thing were to occur, I was not to interfere."
"Pearce was pressed again?"
"Have I not just said so?"
"Then his being a lieutenant is doubly mysterious."
"I must stay out of his way, Fairmeadow. I fear he will not remember me kindly."
There was a terrible temptation for Fairmeadow to say something like, "No, I never will, mate," but he bit his tongue. "Don't look to me for aid, Burns. I don't think he has any regard for me either. You seem to forget I was there the first time he was pressed." Sick of traversing the forecastle, tired of gnawing at his problems, he made his way down to the wardroom, entering a place so capacious it made the accommodation of a frigate look like a hutch. With 8 lieutenants, the usual number of warrants, and 3 marine officers, it needed to be substantial, though it was clearly not roomy enough. The table set across the stern windows was near full, and as he entered, heads turned, and all eyes were upon him in examination. That was until one officer spoke to an open door at the very stern, which brought forth another. "Mr. Pearce, is it not?" The nod got the introduction. "Ingleby, 1st of Victory. Allow me to welcome you to our quarters." "Thank you. You will, of course, realize that we are cramped, so I've had your dunnage sent down to the orlop deck, where there is room in the sick bay to accommodate you. That is for sleeping only, of course. You are at liberty to use this place as you wish." "That is very kind of you. Can I offer you some refreshment?" "I think Lord Hood has seen to that, Mr. Ingleby." "Quite." Ingleby paused, looking not embarrassed exactly, but uncomfortable. "I fear, sir, that you will be inundated with questions regarding the Valmy, since your reputation precedes you." About to ask how, Pearce stopped. Even he knew that on a ship it was near impossible to keep anything secret. He had had the same problem aboard Tartar, the need to recount every detail of the action to satisfy the insatiable curiosity of naval officers who dreamed themselves of such an exploit. "I have impressed upon the wardroom not to hound you, for having received a gazette with the mails, everyone is agog for a first-hand view, though it does not exactly chime with what we have heard about you." "Much praise, I suspect, of Captain Marchand?" "Why, yes," Ingleby replied, before smiling, as though he guessed what Pearce was driving at, that the gazette would have been taken from Marchand's dispatch, and that he was not a man to be modest or even truthful. "I have suggested, perhaps, that we wait until supper, where I hope you will join us for cheese on toasted biscuit and some wine. Perhaps until then, a tour of the ship?" "Thank you." The master allocated him one of his mates, he in turn seeking out the warranted officers, all men of some age and experience, who were only too happy to tell all. Pearce treated them with respect, for to have their posts on this vessel made them very senior people indeed. These were men who had spent a lifetime in the Navy, had worked their way up from one ship to the next, the number of guns rising with each move, their appointments made by the Navy Board, a body with whom they would readily communicate if they felt their pride or their professionalism to be in any way questioned or traduced. In an hour of walking, he learnt that HMS Victory was 226 feet plus a bit long, figurehead to taffrail, just under 52 feet in beam at the widest point, carrying a total of 104 cannon, 44 12-pounders, 28 24-pounders, and on the lower gun deck 30 massive 32-pounders, plus a pair of 68-pounder carronades, known as smashers, on the forecastle, the whole displacing 3,500 tons and carrying a total complement of 850 souls. Veteran of a couple of battles and the relief of Gibraltar in 1782, she had served as a flagship to several admirals, and was held to be one of the finest ships afloat in King George's navy. The last Pearce took with a pinch of salt. It was known, even he knew, that a ship's standing officers never, ever uttered anything but praise for the vessel on which they served. He was back on the main deck, having been in the bowels of the ship amongst futtocks and hanging knees, when the party from Marseille, having concluded their discussions with the admirals, were shown to the entry port, and he was able to bid farewell to men who seemed happier than when they had last talked, buoyed by promises that Pearce suspected were more hopes than realities. That once the French fleet was either taken, destroyed, or rendered ineffective, Hood would return to help them fight off the armies of the Jacobins. While talking, he was being subjected to deep scrutiny by a pair of midshipmen crouched on the steps of a companionway, having raised their heads just enough to see him. But they had to move as the boatswain's whistle sounded to call all hands on deck. Above their heads, the signal was being raised on the mizzenmast, flags that told all ships to wear in succession, that order taking effect with a discharge from the signal gun, their destination, Toulon. "Lieutenant Pearce," said a secretary, "Lord Hood has requested that you attend upon him."
"Sit down, Lieutenant Pearce."
As he complied, Pearce was aware that Hood was using his rank, something he had studiously avoided in their earlier interview, and the realization made him suspicious.
"As you will observe, my secretary is staying with us to take notes on our conversation, and I have asked the captain of the fleet, Rear Admiral Parker, to join us. I take it that you have no objection?"
"That would depend, sir, on the nature of our conversation."
"I can assure you it is in the nature of being official, Lieutenant."
Pearce just nodded. Besides, there was no alternative.
"You sat with our recently departed French guests at dinner?"
Sir Hyde Parker, sleek and well-fed, entered the cabin, and at a nod from Lord Hood sat at the table as Pearce answered. "Have we not covered that fact already?"
"We have, and I dare say over the food and wine they told you as much as they told me in conference."
"Well, that," Pearce insisted, "I would not know since I was not present at your final conference." Glancing in his direction, he saw the look of surprise on Parker's face. Mere lieutenants did not talk back to flag officers in such a way, before Hood addressed his fleet captain, though he was still looking at Pearce.
"You will find, Sir Hyde, that this young man has a unique way of responding to authority. It might be of benefit to us both if I point out to him that he will have no way of persuading me to grant him any favours if he continues in that vein."
"I would point out to you, Lord Hood, that all I seek from you is a just resolution to a clear case of law-breaking."
"And I would respond by saying that you are not the judge of what and what is not illegal."
The threat, delivered without the Admiral raising his voice, was potent nevertheless. Show more respect, or you can whistle for any action in the matter of your impressment. The obvious thing to do was to knuckle under, to behave as any officer of his lowly rank would, and practically grovel to even be allowed into the great man's presence. Was it his bloodline, his Celtic blood, or his own contrary nature that meant he could not do it? Yet he knew he had to somehow soften the atmosphere, and the only thing he could think of was a touch of flattery. "Lord Hood, I am of the mind that your sense of justice will outweigh whatever you see as impertinence, and I would add that I do not mean to be that, merely to state the obvious. If you wished me to tell you in detail what was discussed, I am happy to pass it on."
"I doubt there would be much in the way of difference, though I would like to know what they told you about Toulon."
"Only that they had received representatives from there who were keen that the whole of Provence should declare against the Jacobins. They asked for help, but they were told that none could be spared. It was more important to march on Lyon."
"Meaning?"
"It was not really a question. That they would have to act on their own."
Hood nodded. Did it not strike you that their information on Toulon was limited?
I was given to understand that they were not entirely convinced by the confidence of the Toulon representatives. Marseille, being a commercial port, has no organized body of sailors to question the actions of the town's leading citizens. Apparently, and as luck would have it, Marseille got rid of its zealots a year ago when the government cried danger. 500 of the more radical citizens went to fight on the Rhine and have not returned, so the internal threat is diminished. They are not sure that was the case in Toulon.
"Which leads us to what conclusion?" asked Parker.
I'm sorry, I don't follow you.
"Is it not obvious, Lieutenant Pearce," Parker insisted, "that we need more information?"
John Pearce was suddenly ahead of them. The allusion to his speaking French as well as he did, even perhaps his reputation, and that was without the fact that, given his situation, he was an officer they could part with without loss to the fleet. Parker opened his mouth to speak again, only to be stopped by Hood's hand.
"I think, judging by your expression, Lieutenant, that you have a fair notion of what is coming next."
You want someone to go ashore and find out the true state of affairs?
Correct in nearly every respect, except one, Lieutenant Pearce. We want you to go ashore and find out if Toulon is as ready to declare against Paris as Marseille.
Had Hood deliberately drawn him into impertinence, just so he could openly state that there was a quid pro quo for any action on Michael, Charlie, and Rufus, never mind Barclay? Is that going to be an order?
"That shows the degree of your ignorance, sir," said Parker.
In what way?
"Lord Hood cannot order you to undertake such a duty any more than I could myself. He may request that you undertake it, but you, as an officer, have the right to decline this commission."
Pearce smiled, but it was a grim affair. "Without a stain on my character?"
"I would not go that far, Pearce," Lord Hood added. "But I could ask any lieutenant on the ship to volunteer for the duty, and they would jump at it, even if their knowledge of French was limited."
"They seek to impress you, Lord Hood. I don't." Even as he said it, Pearce knew he was bound to accede. Not to do so would nullify his sole reason for being in the Mediterranean. Refuse, and he would likely find himself on a ship bound for home, for Hood would have dispatches going back to England, and to refuse was not either an option. He would be put aboard whether he liked it or not. Hood slid a piece of paper across the table.
"You would have to go into Toulon by boat and take a chance on not being intercepted. Then it would be necessary to find one of these men at one of these addresses, which you must memorize before you leave."
"The men who went to seek help from Marseille?"
"Correct. They are delegates to the local assembly. It is to be hoped that they could then put you in touch with a sympathetic naval officer who would be able to say what is the sentiment of the fleet, its commander, officers, and sailors."
"When do you expect to raise Toulon?" Accepting that as tantamount to agreement, Hood replied,
"At first light we should have made contact with the vessels sent ahead. I would say, if the conditions were right, no moon to speak of and some cloud cover, we could put you ashore tomorrow night."
"A pity."
"Why?"
demanded Parker. Pearce just shrugged. It seemed to be tactless to say he was hoping to avoid supper in the wardroom. Chapter 15. The naval uniform had to be discarded, and even on a ship with a complement of 850 souls, finding anything approaching a civilian garment that both fitted and designated him as some kind of gentleman was no easy matter. Appearance was important. He could hardly claim to be Hood's representative dressed as a common seaman. In the end, he had to settle for a black coat belonging to Hood's second secretary, the fellow with the ink-stained hands, one that was long enough, but too tight on the chest and under the armpits, and since it looked ridiculous with a sword, he exchanged that for a shorter weapon, a midshipman's dirk. The hat was easier, tricorns being plentiful amongst the warrant officer's shore-going rig. Funds were provided by Hood's secretary, a decent purse of golden guineas, which apparently came from the secret fund and required no signature to account for their use. The fleet made contact with Gould and HMS Firefly by midday, but he had little to impart, having seen it as his duty to avoid contact with the enemy and stay on the station in case a sighting was made or a signal came from HMS Brilliant. Hood had no such scruples. He made straight for the approaches to the French naval port and was close enough by the time he had his dinner to be sighted from Montferrand. If they were still at anchor, he wanted them to see his fleet in the offing, and if they had weighed, to find out for himself. The information from his lookouts, once they had got close enough, was satisfying. Admiral de Trogoff, pre-warned by his own patrols, had already begun to warp his ships back into the Petite Rade, a place where they would be secure from attack by such things as fireships. The only worry was that no sighting had been made of Berkeley or his frigate. Stood bareheaded on the ramparts of the Tour de Mitre in the late afternoon, Ralph Berkeley and his wife watched as the capital ships were towed by their boats through the channel that led to the Petite Rade. He could just see the topsails of his fellow countrymen on the horizon, where he knew, as much as he wished it otherwise, they would stay. The offshore fleet needed sea room in case of a turn in the weather. Being closer to shore would be, in the event of a southerly gale, fraught with peril. To come in even closer was worse. Below his terrace they had already got the furnace going behind the battery of 42-pounder cannon to make red the shot that would be doubly deadly for a wooden vessel, not only smashing wood but starting fires as well. Across the bay, at the bastion near the infirmary, they would be doing the same. Indeed, the shore of the whole outer roadstead was dotted with forts. Any ship sailing into the Grande Rade would be caught between multiple fire from guns heavier than their own, and that with no hope of getting at the enemy vessels in the inner anchorage. "What will happen, husband?" There was just a tinge of hope in Emily's voice, hope that, comfortable as their captivity was, it would soon be over. He hated to dash that anticipation, but the truth could do nothing other than that. "The French will anchor a ship across the entrance to the channel below once all the rest are through, put a spring on her cable till she is broadside on, and effectively shut off the Petite Rade. In an extreme situation they would sink her there." "I meant as regards our ships, not theirs." "Little, I fear. Hotham will blockade, staying just on the horizon to keep the French bottled up. Admiral de Trogoff must wait for a wind strong enough to blow our fleet off station, and then, if he wishes, he can put to sea on that same wind, and either offer battle or try to evade them." There was no point in adding an even more depressing fact, that Toulon had been studied by many naval minds over the years, who had concluded that it could only be taken by soldiers, and then it was not a matter of siege and assault, but of attrition. To even have a chance of attacking the port and the town, any aggressor must first subdue the batteries surrounding the Grande Rade. But that only brought them to stout walls and even more cunningly placed artillery. The defences had been designed by the Marquis de Vauban, Louis XIV's master of the art of fortifications, to discourage an attack from the sea, his aim to make the naval base a nut too tough to crack. Success in such a venture was not impossible, but given the time it would take and the force it would require, Toulon could not be captured before the arrival of a relieving army, so that those invading would have to fight a land battle at the same time as trying to press home a siege. "What would you do if you were a Frenchman?"
"I would only know that if I knew de Trogoff's orders."
Ralph Berkeley declined to add anything about the Admiral obeying them, which was, if Captain Dambert was right, questionable. Thinking of that brought back the memory of that dinner, Saint-Julien unashamedly paying court to his wife, and he had to suppress the feelings that induced, the belief that Emily had thoroughly enjoyed the experience. Certainly she had failed to do what he, or rather Lutyens, had asked. Any information about the state of affairs in the port had been gleaned by him, not her.
"If he can get the rest of his 74s fit for service, He would have an advantage in numbers, but that counts for little if his crews are not worked up, as ours must be. You will have observed aboard Brilliant that men need time to get to know their tasks and each other. If that is true of a ship, it is even more so of a fleet. New to operations, sails take longer to set and take in. Gunnery, the most vital element should it come to a fight, would be slow and poorly aimed, and that against men who have had months of training. If he has orders to get to sea, I would suspect he would try to avoid battle rather than invite it, for that very reason.
Well, not very noble, husband, but I must say, for all he has a title, the Admiral did not strike me as overly endowed with that quality. He seemed a timid little man.
Unlike his second-in-command, perhaps?
Emily did not respond. She knew how he felt, just as she knew to do so, to protest that it was just a bit of raillery, a pleasant diversion from being cooped up in a frigate with the same faces for months, would cut no ice and only lead to an argument. Instead, she pointed up the long arm that enclosed the inner anchorage to the point. "Is that our men returning?" Ralph Barclay nodded as he looked towards the town and the Vieux d'Ars, where his crew had been put to work shifting quarried stone. Led by Sykes, escorted by an armed guard, the dusty and weary Brilliants were trudging back to their underground accommodation. He had visited them at their labours, to find them under the supervision of overseers with whips. A protest had had these removed, but it was a moot point as to whether the National Guardsmen with muskets and prodding bayonets were any less an evil. Emily, already indoors, was tying on her apron before gathering the unctions and ointments gifted her by Lutyens. She had taken it upon herself, each evening, to treat what sores and blisters the men had, and to insist on a transfer to the infirmary of any whom she deemed incapable of further exertion. Ralph Barclay had accompanied her on the first 2 nights, but he wearied of endless attempts at reassurance, had a limited ability to look into sad, exhausted eyes concerned about the future, and a limited fund of words to maintain the hope that all would be well, that either the war would end or that rescue or exchange would arrive in the form of a British fleet. The men might know that had happened this very day. Let Emily be the one to confirm it, for he feared being asked the very same question she had posed, one to which, in terms of time in captivity, there was no answer. "Will you not visit Glaister and the others? They at least should be made aware of what has happened."
"Of course,"
Ralph Barclay replied with some force to cover for the fact that he had completely forgotten about them. With the sun beginning to dip behind the hills to the west, the men on the ground floor had tallow stubs lit in the sconces, which did nothing to make pleasant what was a vista of dank stone walls and a bare earth floor. The news of the fleet lifted the gloom, cheering them immensely, which left their captain wondering how long that would last, though he indulged in a little necessary dissimulation when it was put to him that an exchange might now be arranged, given that officers stood a much better chance in that matter than seamen.
"I am sure," he said without any personal conviction, "that as soon as Admiral Hotham knows of our plight he will send in a flag of truce for just that purpose."
"I thought Lord Hood might come out of his cabin to wish me luck."
Pearce said this as he prepared to lower himself into the waiting boat, bobbing below the entry port and crewed by men from Victory, now heaved to, each one in dark clothing with blackened faces. Ingleby, the Premier, responded with an embarrassed cough and an intimation that the Admiral, no doubt, had more important things on his mind.
The man to whom this was addressed saw it differently. That, for instance, the Admiral saw him as expendable. The cloak he needed to hide his clothing was already in the cutter. He would use his hat to cover his face, for if he did get ashore, blackened features in daylight would attract attention. The midshipman in charge, a youngster called Trevivian, gave the order to shove off, and once clear, the men began to row in steady, rhythmical fashion, while above their heads the orders were issued to get under way. The dying sun lit them as they came out from the lee of the flagship, and being the Mediterranean, that soon turned to a full night in which the moon had yet to rise. Not that it was totally dark. Above their heads the sky was carpeted with stars, and it was only when a cloud obscured them that the men in the boat could feel any sense of security.
"They won't see us from the shore, your honour," said the midshipman in a voice with a strong West Country burr. "We will be like a black dot, the trough of a wave to the eye if we stay mid-channel."
The plan was to land him on the eastern shore of the Grand Rade, between a fort called La Molque and a hill called Point de Brun, which might or might not be home to another battery of cannon. To try to venture into the inner anchorage would be too perilous. Crowded with shipping, it would be awash with guard-boats. They would have those too in the Grand Rade, but in theory they would be less numerous, and given the area they were obliged to cover, easier to avoid. Sitting silently, the only sound the heavy breathing of the oarsman allowed Pearce's imagination to run riot. He saw in the glimmer of the starlight endless chimeras that he took to be boats. Even worse, when the cloud cover increased, and in Stygian darkness, his eyes played more tricks, which induced a longing for this boat journey to be over, and for him to be on dry land. He had no doubt that he could pass himself off as a Frenchman, and in a naval port his accent would not attract any attention from sentinels who must be from all over the country. But that feeling of certainty only applied ashore. At sea, with a bunch of British tars, any close inspection would be fatal, which had him saying out loud, as the moon appeared for a brief moment before slipping behind a cloud again, "What in the name of hell am I doing here?"
"We all wonder that, sir," said one of the oarsmen. "That be what we all feel, your honour, for if we is caught by the Johnny Crappos, it'll be the galleys for the rest of our days."
Pearce shuddered, not willing to add to his inadvertently spoken complaint that for him it would be a firing squad, or if the wrong people were in charge in Toulon, a guillotine. As if to make real what was imagined, a gap appeared in the clouds, and a voice cut through the darkness demanding the private signal for the night, and unshaded a lantern to show the bows of another cutter with a man standing peering into the gloom by the side of a small cannon. The Victory's oarsmen immediately raised their sticks, and the cutter glided to a halt. Pearce had formed in his mind the words, "J'ai oublié le mot," when another voice called out, "Souffrant! La réponse! De Saint-Tropez!" Bobbing up and down slowly, oars still out of the water, Pearce and his rowers sat holding their breath, easier for him than those who had been exerting themselves. The lantern was shaded again, with everyone in the British cutter looking at the sky, at slowly moving clouds tinged with silver edges, praying it would not clear. Pearce, without consulting Trevithian, gave the men an order to row hard and damn the noise, sure that each of the two boats who had exchanged the identification would assume the noise came from the other.
Christ, that was a stroke of luck. Remember those words on the way back to victory, Mr. Trevithian. Souffrant and Saint-Tropez. What do they mean, sir? You a sailor, and you've not heard of Souffrant? I'd be obliged if you would tell me of him, sir. He was an admiral and a hero in the Marine Royale, his full title being Le Bailli de Souffrant de Saint-Tropez, hence the signal. Then, thinking of the boy's accent, and to make safe the journey back, he had him practising saying that, and the French for "I have forgotten the words," all the way to the shore, only to conclude that he would perhaps get away with it if the guard boats thought him Swiss. "They've got an accent then, these Swiss folk."
"I've only met one as far as I know, Mr. Trevithian, a lady called Madame de Stael."
"Oh, madam, God forbid, sir, I should sound like some bawdy-house trollop."
Pearce laughed. Thinking of Germaine de Stael in her Paris salon, the decor as glittering as the company, he wondered how a woman who prided herself on the sharpness of her mind and the acuity of her wit would take to being likened to a trollop. There was no salon now, no dazzling company. To avoid losing her head, rich and witty Germaine had been forced to flee to England, like so many others. Thinking of her took Pearce back to a happier vision of Paris, in the days before those who had brought down the power of the monarchy lost control of the revolution. It had been an especially sweet time for him, a youth growing to manhood, taken everywhere by a favoured guest, his father. He recalled the city in high summer, could remember the festivals held in the Champ de Mars at which all the folk of Paris could mingle, to exchange greetings as citizens, regardless of previous rank, to kiss in amity and exchange flowers. The thought of kisses led on to those he had bestowed and received, and of those women in salons like that of Germaine de Staël, who had espied and seduced a young, handsome fellow in the full knowledge of their compliant husbands. Happy times indeed. The prospect of beaching brought his mind sharply back to the present, and the knowledge that landing in the right place, the eastern arm of the Grande Rade, would be achieved more by chance than sure knowledge, given that Trevithian had used as guides what sightings he could get of the North Star, and the twinkling but distant lights from various points around the arms of the bay. Another break in the cloud showed that such methods had sufficed, as the cutter grounded on soft sand. They waited in silence for a full minute, to ensure that there were no foot patrols to worry about before Pearce was carried ashore, for, as Trevithian insisted, "It would not do, sir, to be seen ploughing along pretending to be a local with squelching boots." His passenger gave him one more go at the password, took the lantern he would need to help them locate him, then set off up the beach, sniffing the night air, catching on at a whiff of pines, thinking that here he was again, an alien ashore in France for the 4th time since the start of the year. Those pines lay a short way inland, thin trees set well apart at ground level, but with enough of a canopy above to blot out any light from stars or the moon. To keep going was to stumble and almost certainly trip and fall, so Pearce sat down, Dirk by his side, pulled his cloak around him, and using the tricorn as a pillow, fell asleep with his back to a tree. Those same trees blotted out the rising sun, so it was well up before he fully awoke from what had been fitful slumber. His first thought that he had not fetched with him anything to drink, and that as a consequence he had a raging thirst. Pine needles over sandy soil would provide no relief, so Pearce began to walk towards what he could see of the sun as it filtered through the canopy. Rising ground directed him to the left, and after some 10 minutes of walking he emerged into open country, cultivated fields, with the town of Toulon rising into the foothills of Montferrand visible to the north. Looking to the south, he saw smoke rising from a hill which he suspected was the redoubt on the Pointe de Brun. A dusty, rotted track ran from there, parallel to the woods, so, cloak off and rolled under his arm, with the dirk inside and readily available, he strode out and away from what danger that represented. Hot in his ill-fitting coat, the discomfort of thirst increased, so Pearce was glad to spy a small village at the base of another hill. There were a few houses only, one of which had a table outside under an awning of reeds, and an owner who was obviously an ex-sailor, for even with only one leg he had the rolling gait and the dress to confirm it. Rough wine was not the thing to quench a thirst. That came from a bunch of juicy grapes, which accompanied his bread and cheese. That the silver he paid with was not French brought forth no comment from the lame proprietor, though the look spoke of curiosity. But nothing was said. Pearce surmised that the fellow, like so many of his countrymen, was grateful to be paid in coin of any kind rather than assignat, the increasingly worthless paper currency of the Revolution. Carrying a second bunch of grapes, eating them slowly, Pearce made his way towards the walls of the city, stone ramparts buttressed by an earthen fosse to absorb cannon shot. This presented a problem, the gate being guarded by armed National Guardsmen who, with the roast-beef ships newly come, would probably be in a high state of alert. Watching from the shade of a nearby stable, he saw several people, civilians and soldiers, present papers, passes that let them through. Those that did not, the costermongers and farmers carrying produce into the town to be sold at the market, were obviously well known and greeted as such. Must he rob someone for their pass? Could he get through that gate without one? Still popping grapes, Pearce pondered that as he watched, thinking that confusion might work just as well. It seemed an age before an opportunity presented itself, as two carts, one entering, one exiting through the narrow opening, became entangled, leading to a loud dispute between the drivers. At the same time, a group of besmocked children appeared on the road, being shepherded along by nuns, the whole party obviously heading for the gate. It was a risk, but it was one he had to take, for nothing could be achieved lest he was on the inside of the fortifications. So, placing a hand inside the wrapped cloak to take hold of the dirk, he walked out as the last of the children passed him and, as they approached the gate, began to shoo them along. Preoccupied trying to untangle the carts, the sentries gave him a level of attention which was compromised not just by that, but by their need to raise their hats to the nuns, an act which actually surprised Pearce, given that such obeisance to religion would have seen them slung into prison in revolutionary Paris. Still shooing the children, calling out at them to "Allez, allez, mes enfants," Pearce looked right at one of the sentries and gave a half shrug, mouthed "Les jeunes" with a weary expression, and carried straight on, any curiosity deflected by the deepening argument behind him as the two carters exchanged in a crescendo of mutual recrimination. By the time the sentry turned back to look, Pearce was nowhere to be seen. The buildings inside the wall were widely spaced, with little sense of order, laying as they did between what was an outer fortification and the old town defences, the gates of which, unmanned, led to a mass of narrow alleys off a wide quay. That ran round an inner harbour lined with high warehouses, with bastions at the outer edge on either side of a sea-going entry port, one just big enough, Pearce reckoned, for a major warship to pass. Since he could see one huge vessel still under construction, surrounded as it was by scaffolds, it had to be. But that only held his attention for so long. As he walked towards the midpoint of the quay, he saw the stern of another ship, a frigate, crawling with men on both the deck and in the rigging. And there, right in front of his eyes, large in gold lettering, was the name Brilliant. Chapter 16. Pearce stopped dead, his mind working furiously to make sense of what he could see, dismissing the thought that the ship could be a French frigate with the same name, since the word brilliant translated as éclat. He knew that proper deep-sea navy men could look at a ship, even at sea, and tell her name from her lines or her figurehead, just as he knew very well that it was a skill he did not possess. Also he could see that a lot of the timberwork was new, pale against the painted and weathered remainder, which confirmed the thought he found he was strangely reluctant to contemplate, that a ship on which he had served, however reluctantly, had been taken in battle. He might hate Barclay with a passion, but there had been good men on that ship, men who had, in their own way, defied the captain. What had happened to them? John Pearce had never had an electric shock, all the rage when he had been growing up as the latest thing, a cure for all ills, for there had never been the money for what his father damned as quackery. But on hearing the voice of Robert Sykes bellowing out an order to someone to "shift his ass," he reckoned that Dr. Graham and his experiments could not have delivered better. He had to stop himself immediately, facing towards that voice. In fact, he forced himself to turn away and look out over the debris-filled waters of the inner basin, though experiencing partial relief, for Sykes was one of the good people he had just been thinking about. "We ain't aboard ship now, Sykes, so you can go and stuff yourself." Kemp, thought Pearce, "You little rat-faced shit," as Sykes replied, "You was a lazy sod aboard ship, Kemp, and you ain't changed." "Why's we toiling so hard anyways?" Kemp demanded in that well-remembered whine. "'Cause, idiot, if we don't work, we don't get fed." To walk away was agonizing, but essential. If Brilliant had been taken, judging by the extent of the repairs having put up a fight, there was nothing he could do about it, and that applied to the crew slaving for their captors as much as the ship. What had happened to Barclay? A thought that brought forth a flash of sympathy as he recalled the man's wife. Closer to him were Martin Dent and the Scotsman Dysart, but most of all was the last of his fellow pelicans, Ben Walker, the remaining member of that band that had formed on being pressed. Ben had elected to stay aboard rather than join his companions and go back to a life avoiding arrest for a crime he would never name. On the open quay it was hard to find a spot from which to observe, certainly one close enough to avoid being seen. So when he did turn to look, well past the prow of the frigate, the faces were indistinct, made more so by the straw hats the men had fashioned to keep the sun off their heads. Height was a clue, for Ben Walker was slight, but he could not make out anyone who looked or moved like him. Imagining a bold rescue, he looked towards the armed guards, who were eyeing their prisoners, if not exactly guarding them, more content to rest their backsides on bollards and smoke their pipes. That was a thought that had to be killed off. What could he do, one man? Perhaps the mission he was on might provide the answer. Perhaps he could attain liberty not just for Michael, Charlie, and Rufus, but for Ben Walker and the crewmen of HMS Brilliant as well.